40,000 years ago, Earth was not a quiet planet. It was a world suspended between ice and fire, where continents groaned beneath endless glaciers, and winds carried the roar of storms that lasted entire seasons. The northern hemisphere was locked beneath towering sheets of ice thicker than city skylines. Rivers froze, forests tightened into jagged clusters of pine and spruce, and the horizon was a blur of white and iron gray. This was the final age of the Great Cold, a time when survival demanded more than strength. It demanded instinct, adaptability, and an almost supernatural resilience. But in that frozen world, something extraordinary was true, something we rarely acknowledge today. We were not alone, not by a long shot. Humanity, as we understand it now, the single species that walks Earth today, was merely one branch of a vast and tangled family tree, a tree that once flourished with many kinds of humans. Some were taller than us. Some were stronger, with bones like iron. Some were smaller than our children, yet carried an intelligence that defies easy explanation. Others roamed mountains so high that most modern humans would suffocate before reaching their hunting grounds. And some left behind almost nothing but whispers in our genes. We share the world with none of them now. Their names barely appear in textbooks. Their faces remain silhouettes. Their voices have turned to dust. And yet, for nearly 2 million years, they lived, hunted, dreamed, and evolved beside us. They watched the same auroras, carved tools from the same stone, and faced the same predators. For vast stretches of time, our species, Homo sapiens, was simply one more figure on a crowded stage. But something happened, something immense, something irreversible. About 40,000 years ago, the others vanished from the archaeological record. Not one by one, but in a wave, an astonishing extinction event that affected every continent where humans lived. The Neanderthals disappear in Europe. The Denisovans cease to exist in Asia. The small-bodied humans of Indonesia fade into myth. The shadow species of Africa, whose DNA we still carry, leave no skeletons behind at all. And perhaps most mysterious of all, lineages we have not yet named vanished without ever being fully discovered. We are told that modern humans outcompeted them. We are told it was simple evolution, but surviving traces buried in our genomes whisper a far more complex story. To understand that story, we must go back, not to the rise of civilization, not even to the first modern humans, but further, back into the snow-muffled dawn of the late Pleistocene, when humanity existed as a constellation of different beings, each species shaped by the land that raised it, each holding a secret about what it meant to be human, long before the word human gained its modern meaning. The land itself sculpted our diversity. Europe's frozen plains birthed colossal hunters with barrel chests and unparalleled strength. The mountains of Siberia produced people adapted to bitter cold and impossible altitudes. The jungles of Southeast Asia shaped small-bodied humans with unexpected tools and deep, mysterious origins. And Africa, ancient, vast, and diverse, carried lineages so old that their DNA still pulses through millions of people today, despite their bones never being found. This lost world wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't a single empire of competing tribes. It was an ecosystem of intelligent, adaptable beings, each thriving in their own way. So why did only one of them survive? This question haunts archaeologists, geneticists, and historians alike. Some argue climate change shattered their habitats. Others claim disease followed modern humans like a shadow. Some see evidence of cooperation, interbreeding, and shared cultures. And yet, beneath all theories lies a deeper, more unsettling mystery. How did one species, our species, manage to outlast all others, in every environment, across every continent, within the same narrow window of time? Was it intelligence alone? Was it language? Was it violence? Was it accident? Or was it something else? Something still hidden in the layers of our evolution, waiting to be uncovered? When we examine the archaeological layers, a pattern emerges. Not abrupt destruction, but gradual fading. Campsites grow smaller, tools become rarer, migration routes empty, cultural signatures, once vibrant, simply dissolve into nothing. It's as if the world dimmed, piece by piece, leaving only one lineage to inherit the earth. Yet each lost species has a story that refuses to stay buried. Neanderthal DNA shapes our immune system. Denisovan genes help millions breathe in the world's highest mountains. Mysterious African lineages hide in our genome like ghosts from deep time. And the cultural echoes, burials, pigments, ornaments, hint that our species may not have been the only one with art, ritual, memory, and meaning. Maybe we are not alone in being human. Maybe we were never alone. The forgotten species didn't vanish quietly. Their legacy flows in our blood, hides in our cells, and lingers in myths of giants, little people, mountain spirits, and ancient tribes. Across cultures, from Aboriginal Australia to Siberia, from the Himalayas to the Rift Valley, stories of other humans persist. Beings who lived beside us, taught us, frightened us, or simply faded into night. What if those stories are not imagination? What if they are memory? To uncover the truth, we must step into a world that predates civilization, writing, cities, and even agriculture. A world still half lit by firelight, trembling beneath the weight of glaciers, and humming with the presence of multiple human species. A world filled with mysteries we have only begun to unravel. And as we enter this lost world, we must ask ourselves one final question. If we truly were not the only humans, then what happened to the others? Because what comes next, what the fossil record reveals, what genetic studies expose, and what ancient stories imply, will challenge everything we think we know about our origins. And what comes next will change everything. The last line still echoes in the cold air. What comes next will change everything. And it must, because to understand why the other humans vanished, we must first understand the world in which they lived. A world that was never meant for only one species. A world sculpted by ice, fractured by continents, and shaped by time scales far longer than our civilizations have ever endured. 40,000 years ago, the Earth was dominated by what scientists call the late Pleistocene. But to the humans who walked it, there was no such name. There was only the wind, the hunt, the cold, and survival. This was a world of extremes, so brutal and yet so fertile for evolution that it produced not one kind of human, but many. Not variations, not tribes, entire species. And the first thing you must understand is that these beings did not consider themselves less than us. They had no idea that one day they would be classified, labeled, measured, or reduced to footnotes in scientific papers. They hunted, laughed, bled, grieved, raised children, and told stories around firelight, just as we did. They lived in a world where humanity had many faces, many forms, many adaptations. To travel through this world is to step into a landscape where evolution never stopped experimenting. Imagine the Earth then, not from above, but with your feet in the snow, with your breath forming clouds in the frozen air. The northern continents were wrapped in glaciers, so immense that they pushed mountains aside. Mammoths marched across open tundra like slow-moving continents of fur and muscle. Saber-toothed cats ruled forests, where pine trees groaned beneath the weight of frost. Giant hyenas, towering over their modern descendants, tore into carcasses left behind by hunters. And humans, different kinds of humans, lived among these giants, not as observers, but as participants in the same unforgiving cycle. Each species had carved out its own niche, its own survival strategy, and each one believed in its own way that it belonged to this world. The first major force shaping human diversity was isolation. When continents were colder and sea levels lower, land bridges appeared where oceans exist today. But these bridges often closed abruptly as the climate shifted. A single rising of the sea could turn a population into an island species. A sudden freeze could trap a tribe behind impassable glaciers. These environmental barriers acted like evolutionary laboratories. They separated, sculpted, and refined human species in directions that seem almost impossible today. In Africa, the heartland of all humanity, multiple human lineages coexisted long before any of them left the continent. Some had larger brains, some smaller. Some were tall, long-limbed runners adapted to the savanna. Others were compact, built for forests dense with vegetation. Fossils found in places like Jebel Irhoud, Homo, and Laetoli reveal that even early Homo sapiens were far more diverse than we imagine today. But not all African humans belonged to our species. There were older lineages, mysterious, fragmented, genetically deep, lineages whose DNA still pulses in millions of people today, though their bones have turned to dust. Further north, in Europe and Western Asia, the Neanderthals evolved in an environment that demanded strength, endurance, and mastery of cold. Their bodies grew wide, thick-boned, and immensely powerful. Their chests expanded to hold lungs capable of extracting precious heat from frigid air. Their hands, broad and muscled, shaped tools so robust that some could split animal bone like wood. They were not clumsy brutes. They were ice world specialists. But deep in Siberia, another species emerged, one we only discovered through its DNA, as if it refused to reveal itself fully. These were the Denisovans, whose existence we infer not from skeletons, but from genetic traces found in modern populations across Asia and Oceania. Their bodies remain a mystery, but their adaptations speak loudly. Genes that empower modern Tibetans to breathe at high altitudes, genes that protect against cold, genes that hint at unusual strength. They were giants, not in myth, but in biology, shaped by mountains that scrape the sky. In the islands of Southeast Asia, evolution danced to a different rhythm. Isolation pressed down so intensely that some humans shrank over generations. The result was a species standing barely over a meter tall, Homo floresiensis, often nicknamed hobbits, though the truth is even stranger. Their brains were small, but their tools were advanced. They hunted pygmy elephants 10 times their size. They survived volcanic eruptions and storms that wiped out entire animal populations, and then, mysteriously, they vanished. Nearby, another island, Luzon, gave rise to yet another small-bodied human species, Homo luzonensis, whose bones were discovered only in the last decade. Their story is still unfolding, but the implications are staggering. The human family tree is more complex, more fractured, and more full of surprises than anyone expected. And far to the south, on the African plains, there were the deep-time outliers like Homo naledi, a species with a small brain but hands shaped for tool-making, feet built for walking upright, and habits that challenge everything we thought we knew. Evidence suggests they may have practiced intentional burials long before such rituals were attributed to modern humans. These were not primitive animals. These were people. Different, yes, but undeniably human in their own way. Now imagine Earth as a mosaic of these species, each occupying its own ecological space, each evolving according to the pressures and rhythms of its environment. Their interactions were not constant. They were separated by mountains, rivers, deserts, and climate. They evolved alone, together, apart, and through contact all at once. It was a dynamic world of divergence and convergence, of meeting and parting, of sharing landscapes and losing them. This was the world Homo sapiens was born into, a world already full of humans. But our species carried something new, something subtle at first. then unmistakable, a combination of traits that was not superior in strength, nor in endurance, nor even in intelligence as we measure it. Instead, it was something else, a form of mental flexibility, social cooperation, and symbolic imagination that grew slowly, generation by generation, a quiet spark that eventually became a fire. And that fire would change everything, because when modern humans began expanding out of Africa, they didn't simply move as individuals, they moved as networks, interconnected groups sharing knowledge, tools, songs, myths, strategies, and visions of the world. They carried stories, they carried memory, they carried meaning. In a world of many humans, Homo sapiens became something like a superorganism, where knowledge lived not in a single mind but in the collective, where culture became a tool more powerful than any spear, where cooperation extended beyond bloodlines. And while other humans also cooperated, their population sizes were smaller, their genetic diversity narrower, their territories more constrained. This difference, small at first, would shape the fate of every species. But the world of many humans did not collapse all at once. Their stories did not end with a single catastrophe or a single event. Their disappearances, though clustered in time, were the result of 1,000 pressures merging into one dramatic transformation of the human landscape. To understand their final days, we must explore the borders where species met, the places where Neanderthals first saw sapiens, the valleys where Denisovans glimpsed strangers, the islands where small-bodied humans watched tall newcomers arrive, because contact, real, physical, biological contact, was the beginning of the end. And yet, it was also the beginning of us. Everything turns at these points of encounter. And what happened when the species finally met would ignite a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The last words drift like smoke in the frozen wind. What happened when the species finally met would ignite a chain of events no one could have predicted. To understand that moment, we must narrow the vast landscape of the late Pleistocene and walk quietly into the borderlands. These were the seams of the ancient world, places where one human species ended and another began. A valley, a river crossing, a mountain pass, a coastline where migrations converged like destiny written in the tide. For tens of thousands of years, most human species never saw each other. Their worlds were isolated by ice, oceans, deserts, and the sheer vastness of unclaimed wilderness. But slowly, subtly, our species began to expand. Not in a sudden conquering wave, but in threads, small groups following rivers, tracking herds, seeking shelter from storms, or chasing rumors of fertile land. Each movement was small, but over time, the movements connected. The threads wove into paths, and the paths wove into migrations that crossed entire continents. And then, contact became inevitable. Historians often imagine the first encounter between Homo sapiens and another human species as violent, even apocalyptic. But the truth is far more complicated and far more human. The archaeological record tells a quieter story at first. No battlefields, no mass graves, no sudden fires or raised settlements. Instead, shared tools, overlapping hunt sites, and signs that two species stood on the same ground within the same season. Imagine a clearing at dusk somewhere in the Levant, the sun sinking behind limestone cliffs, the air cold enough to sting the lungs, a herd of gazelles moving cautiously across the plain, and two groups of hunters, one Neanderthal, one modern human, tracking the same animals, their footprints weaving across each other in soft sediment. They never leave evidence of violence. They leave evidence of presence. In those early moments, the first contact was not a clash, but a coexistence. Yet coexistence is not peace, and it is not understanding. To the Neanderthals, Homo sapiens must have seemed strange, more slender, more delicate in appearance, but moving with a nimble, almost restless energy. Their tools were finer, lighter. Their clothes were sewn with bone needles, something Neanderthals may not have used. Their faces were narrow, their minds filled with symbols scratched into bone, ochre patterns on stone, and marks that meant something beyond simple utility. To our ancestors, the Neanderthals must have appeared powerful. Their shoulders were massive, their hands capable of crushing bone. Their eyes, set deeper beneath heavy brow ridges, saw better in dim light. Their hearing was tuned to different frequencies. Their gait, though heavy, was steady and deliberate. They were masters of the cold in a way modern humans have never been. Neither species could have predicted that they were not simply meeting another tribe. They were meeting another version of humanity. And what happens when one kind of human meets another for the first time? Curiosity, fear, recognition. The truth is that we don't know, and yet the evidence suggests a mixture of all three. Some contact zones show signs of temporary sharing. A cave where tools from two species appear side by side. A hearth structure used first by Neanderthals, later by modern humans, within a span of years so short they might have met face to face. In other places, the layers alternate rapidly, as if territories shifted back and forth. One group arriving, leaving, returning, moving on. But there was something else too. Something that changed the biological fate of both species. They interbred, not often, not casually, not as a blending of cultures, but enough. When a Neanderthal and a modern human created a child, that child carried a genetic mixture that would ripple across tens of thousands of years until it reached us. Today, every non-African human carries between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. For some people in Asia and Oceania, another 3 to 6% comes from the Denisovans. These genetic traces are not irrelevant. They shape our skin's reaction to sunlight, our immune response to disease, our sleep patterns, and even how we process oxygen at high altitudes. These ancient encounters left fingerprints on our bodies. But how did the first hybrid child come to be? Was it a peaceful merging of groups, a negotiated exchange, a union between individuals who saw in each other something familiar or something forbidden? Or was it coercion, violence, desperation? The record cannot answer. It can only show us the outcome. The interbreeding was rare enough that the species remained distinct for tens of thousands of years, but consistent enough that genes flowed between them. And in that genetic flow lies one of the most unsettling truths of all. Our species may not have outcompeted the others solely through culture or technology. We may have absorbed them, piece by piece, lineage by lineage, until their unique identities blurred into ours. Yet the story is not fully one of replacement. It is also one of conflict. As modern humans expanded, Neanderthal populations began to shrink. At first slowly, then sharply. Their camps became fewer. Their artifacts, once common across Europe, grew scarce. Their territories retreated into isolated pockets, mountains, caves, river valleys where they held on as long as they could. Some Neanderthal groups likely avoided contact entirely, withdrawing deeper into the cold lands they knew so well. Others lived on the margins of sapiens-dominated territories, trading space for survival. But as climate instability increased and resources shifted, encounters became more frequent. And with each encounter, the balance tipped. Why? What gave Homo sapiens the edge? Not strength, not even intelligence, not in any simple sense. It was something more abstract, something more dangerous, something that archaeologists now call cumulative culture. The ability to learn, remember, share, and innovate at a pace no other human species could match. We built social networks that spanned dozens of groups. We transmitted knowledge across generations with precision. We shared tools, hunting strategies, stories, and spiritual beliefs that bound us together. A spear design developed in one valley could spread across an entire continent in a matter of centuries. A myth whispered by firelight could travel farther than any hunter. A tool perfected in one camp could become standard in dozens of others. Culture became our superpower, and no other species could match it. Yet, even with all our advantages, the disappearance of the others was not swift. It took thousands of years, thousands of winters, thousands of migrations, encounters that were sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent, sometimes intimate, sometimes fatal, but each meeting, each contact, tipped the balance just a little more. By 40,000 years ago, the contact zones that once held possibility became lines of retreat. The Neanderthals were pushed into fewer refugees. The Denisovans withdrew deeper into Siberia and the Himalayas. The small-bodied humans of Indonesia faced pressures they had never known, and the shadow species of Africa left their last traces in the genomes of those who survived. The world was changing: climate, food, territory, but more importantly, mind. And as modern humans spread, the others began to fade. The moment of first contact had sparked something irreversible. Not conquest, not genocide, not simple replacement, but a gradual, inevitable shift in the fabric of humanity itself. Because once the species met, their destinies became intertwined, their futures became one, and the age of many humans quietly began its slow descent into the age of one. What happened next would mark the beginning of the end for the greatest rivals we ever had. The last line lingers like a fading ember. The beginning of the end for the greatest rivals we ever had. But before their final chapter, we must understand their prime, the long era when Neanderthals dominated a world that modern humans had not yet touched. For nearly 500,000 years, they thrived across a harsh and unpredictable landscape, mastering an environment that would have shattered less resilient species. They were not our shadows. They were not failed prototypes. They were an entirely different branch of humanity, perfectly adapted to the world they inherited. To walk into Neanderthal territory is to feel the weight of a colder earth. Imagine a Europe sculpted by endless winters, forests of birch and pine rattling beneath icy winds, plains where mammoths moved in slow herds, reshaping snowdrifts with every step, caves carved by ancient rivers now serving as sanctuaries against blizzards. This was a world of survival, and the Neanderthals mastered it so completely that they left their mark across thousands of miles, from the Atlantic shores to the Siberian steppes. Their bodies told the story of their adaptation. Broad chests like living furnaces, thick bones capable of absorbing impacts that would cripple a modern human, hands powerful enough to snap tough sinew and shape stone with methodical precision. Their faces, often misunderstood, were designed for strength and cold endurance, large noses for warming icy air, heavy brow ridges for thick muscle attachments, and deep-set eyes that pierced dim winter light. But these physical traits were not the full measure of who they were. Neanderthals lived in social groups, tight-knit, cooperative, and resilient. They cared for their injured. They buried their dead, often carefully, sometimes with tools or tokens that hint at meaning beyond simple disposal. They made tools so complex that some archaeologists believe their craftsmanship exceeded ours in certain techniques. Their stone points were robust, their hafting methods advanced, their ability to work in bone and wood underestimated for decades. And then there is the fire. Neanderthals did not simply use fire, they mastered it. They built hearths in structured patterns. They cooked food methodically. They heated stone to improve its workability, a technique once thought to be uniquely sapiens. They survived winters that would have killed us without layers of clothing, shelters, and fire maintenance that bordered on engineering. Their intelligence was not ours. Their mindset was not ours. But they were not inferior. If anything, they were specialists, humans tailored to endure one of the most brutal climates the Earth has ever known. So how did such a dominant species begin its long fade? The beginning of their decline is subtle. It is not marked by a single event, but by a slow, creeping fragmentation. Their population sizes were always small, scattered bands, often isolated by vast distances. The same cold that shaped them also limited how many could survive in any given region. They lived close to the edge, balancing between abundance and starvation year after year. For tens of thousands of years, they managed this delicate equilibrium, but equilibrium is fragile. Around 60,000 years ago, the climate began to swing violently, not once, not twice, but again and again in a series of dramatic shifts known as Dansgaard-Oeschger events. Rapid warming and cooling cycles that transformed ecosystems within decades. Forests expanded, then died. Rivers froze, then flooded. Herds migrated erratically. And Neanderthal territories, once familiar and stable, fractured. At the same time, our species, Homo sapiens, began moving into these lands. We were different. We adapted faster to change. We shared information widely. We traveled farther. Our social networks connected clans, spread across whole regions, and our population, though still small, grew steadily, each generation adding knowledge that could be passed onward. When Neanderthals encountered us during these climate swings, the differences between our approaches to survival became more than biological. They became existential. The archaeological layers reveal something haunting. In valleys where Neanderthals once thrived, we begin to see alternating occupations. A Neanderthal hearth, then a sapiens hearth, then Neanderthal again. Patterns like flickering lights in the dark. For a while, the species shared space, sometimes at different seasons, sometimes within the same decade, but eventually something changed. Where once there were alternating layers, the pattern ends, and only one species remains. Why did the Neanderthals retreat? Why did their presence diminish? Some researchers point to the climate instability. Others emphasize our larger social groups, our ability to support elders, children, and injured members more efficiently. But there is another factor, quieter but potentially devastating: genetic fragility. Neanderthal populations were small for so long that their genetic diversity had eroded. Harmful mutations, normally diluted by large populations, accumulated. Their immune systems were powerful on the local pathogens they evolved with, but vulnerable to the viral and bacterial worlds that modern humans carried from Africa, where diseases were older, more diverse, more adaptable. To a Neanderthal, a sickness that barely slowed, a sapiens child could be fatal. Yet extinction was not immediate. They persisted. They resisted. Their final refuges held for thousands more years. In the caves of Gibraltar, they survived long after most of Europe had emptied. Some of the last Neanderthal fires burned there while modern humans were already painting in France and shaping ornaments in the Near East. What makes their final years so heartbreaking is not their disappearance, it is how long they held on. Small groups, isolated in mountains, huddled in caves against storms, hunting with dwindling numbers, sharing what little food remained, watching as the world warmed slowly, reshaping the territories they once knew intimately. They were not conquered by modern humans. They were surrounded by time, but contact with us did leave its mark. Our DNA holds their memory, fragments of Neanderthal. Immune genes protect us against infections. Neanderthal variants influence our skin, hair, metabolism, and even our sleep cycles. They live inside us, quietly, subtly, ghosts encoded in chromosomes. And so their disappearance is not a story of defeat. It is a story of absorption, a story of transformation, a story where one species fades, but its legacy bleeds invisibly into another. But while the Neanderthals are the most familiar of the lost humans, their tale is only the beginning. They were not alone in facing the arrival of modern humans, and some of the others, the ones who vanished in Asia, carved mysteries far deeper and far stranger into the human story. Because far to the east, in lands of icy forests and mountains that scraped the sky, another species watched us arrive, a species even more enigmatic, even more powerful, and far less understood. The Denisovans were waiting, and what we discover about them will challenge everything we think we know about being human. The final words of the last block echo in the dark. The Denisovans were waiting. But waiting where? Waiting how? And why does their story feel so different from every other vanished human species? The truth is unsettling. We know almost nothing about them, and yet they have shaped millions of lives. To speak of the Denisovans is to step into a realm where evidence is scarce, but implications are enormous. Their entire existence hinges on a fragment, a splinter of bone found in a Siberian cave no larger than your thumb, a tiny scrap of finger from a young girl. That is all we physically had for years. No skull, no tools we can confidently assign, no complete skeletons, no villages, no artwork, no burial sites. They are a human species that hid itself so well that only the cold walls of a remote cave preserved their whispers. Yet from that tiny bone, extracted in the stillness of a modern laboratory, scientists unlocked a revelation that shook our understanding of ancient humanity. Inside that fragment was a genome belonging to a species as distinct from Neanderthals as Neanderthals are from us. A new type of human, a new branch of the human story, one we had never seen before. And the shock didn't end there. When geneticists compared Denisovan DNA with that of modern populations in Asia, Indonesia, and Oceania, they found something extraordinary. Millions of living people carry Denisovan genes. Some populations have up to 6% of their genome coming from these mysterious humans. This meant one thing and one thing only. We met them. We lived beside them. We interbred with them, and our ancestors passed their blood forward into our veins. But who were they? To understand the Denisovans, we must travel to the land where their story was found, the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a massive landscape of towering peaks, ancient forests, and winter winds so sharp they slice through layers of fur and hide. In these mountains lies Denisova Cave, a silent vault of human history, where layers of sediment have recorded nearly 300,000 years of life. Inside this cave, excavators discovered something strange: a Neanderthal tooth in one layer, a Denisovan tooth in another, fragments from a hybrid child, a first-generation mix of Neanderthal mother and Denisovan father, buried deeper still. 3 species of humans used this cave at different times, sometimes close enough that their ash mingled. And yet, the Denisovans remain invisible. Their bones are sparse, their tools uncertain. They do not appear in the fossil record like the Neanderthals. They have no obvious art, no painted caves, no carved symbols, at least none we can confidently identify. Instead, their legacy is written not in stone, but in DNA. And that DNA is extraordinary. Denisovan genes help Tibetans survive the thin air of the Himalayas. They allow some populations in Papua New Guinea to metabolize energy differently. They strengthen immune systems in East Asia. They contribute to physical endurance, cold adaptation, and perhaps even skeletal robustness. This is where the legends begin. Across the mountains of Central Asia and Tibet, stories persist of ancient giants, beings taller than humans, broader, stronger, spirits of stone and ice who lived in caves high above the clouds. Some tales describe them as guardians, others as rivals, but almost all describe them as people, not animals, not beasts, but people. And in Melanesia, stories speak of ancestors who were not quite human, who lived before the arrival of modern humans, and who left their mark in the form of children with unusual strength and uncommon stamina. Are these myths, or are they memories passed down through thousands of generations? The Denisovans themselves remain elusive, but their genome tells us they diverged from Neanderthals almost 400,000 years ago. This means that for nearly 500,000 years, they developed separately, growing strong in environments humans rarely visited. Their territories likely stretched across Siberia, Mongolia, northern China, and deep into Southeast Asia. Some researchers believe they might be the creators of certain stone tools found in northern China that seemed too advanced for earlier hominins, but too old for modern humans. Others propose that massive hominins like Gigantopithecus, the enormous ape that lived in Southeast Asia, may have overlapped with Denisovans. The speculation is irresistible. Could early stories of giant humans be rooted in memories of these powerful, mountain-adapted beings? But precisely because we know so little, a strange silence surrounds them. Why so few bones? Why so little evidence? How did a species so genetically influential leave so little behind? One theory suggests they lived predominantly in regions where bone preservation is poor. Humid environments, acidic soils, tropical climates where remains dissolve in centuries instead of millennia. Another theory suggests they lived in small, mobile groups, spreading thinly across massive mountain ranges. A third theory is more dramatic, that they lived in the high-altitude regions modern humans found nearly uninhabitable, places where only the strongest could survive. If so, this would mean their disappearance was not due to weakness, but because they lived at the edge of the world, high above, isolated, difficult to find, impossible to chase. But eventually, we reached them. Wherever our species roamed, the Denisovans were there, quietly, sparsely, but undeniably. And when we met them, as with the Neanderthals, we interbred, not once, but multiple times, each time leaving genetic signatures that still influence us today. This interbreeding is perhaps the most intriguing clue of all, because Denisovan DNA in modern humans does not come from a single ancient encounter. It comes from different regions of Asia at different times, involving different Denisovan groups. This means they were not one population, but many, a spread-out, diverse species that occupied vast territories, almost invisible to archaeology, yet deeply imprinted on our biology. Their disappearance remains an enigma. Unlike the Neanderthals, they left no final refuges, no last stand, no clear timeline. They simply dissolve from the record like snow melting into the soil. But their DNA remains in millions of people, in traits that shape human life today, in clues that whisper of a species far more widespread and far more resilient than we have ever imagined. But if the Denisovans are the shadow giants of our past, then the species we examine next shatter that pattern entirely. Because far from Asia, on a tiny island in the Indonesian archipelago, another human species survived, not as giants, but as small-bodied survivors who defy everything we think we know about evolution. A species so small, so strange, and yet so skilled that their very existence challenges what it means to be human. And their story is even more mysterious. The last line still vibrates in the dark. Their story is even more mysterious. And it is, because while the Neanderthals dominate Europe and the Denisovans shape the mountains of Asia, another species of human thrived far to the south, on islands so remote that the sea itself acted as a barrier stronger than any glacier. Here, in the tangled jungles and volcanic cliffs of Indonesia, evolution took a turn so drastic that it feels mythic, as if plucked from folklore rather than prehistoric fact. This is where we meet one of the strangest humans who ever lived, a species that does not fit the expected patterns, a species that challenges everything we think we know about size, intelligence, and human potential. On the island of Flores, an isolated patch of land surrounded by deep waters, archaeologists uncovered a small skeleton in 2003. Its skull was the size of a grapefruit. Its height barely reached the shoulder of a modern child, and yet its bones told a story of tools, hunting, fire, and long-term adaptation. They named it Homo floresiensis. The world quickly called them the hobbits. But these were not mythical beings. They were real. They hunted real animals. They left real tools. And they existed long after they were supposed to be gone. To understand the gravity of this discovery, imagine a fully adult human who stands roughly 1 meter tall, about 3.5 feet. Imagine a brain 1/3 the size of yours, and then imagine that this small person lived on an island filled with giant lizards, ancient elephants the size of cows, and birds with claws carved like scythes. Despite their size, Homo floresiensis thrived here for tens of thousands of years. They crafted stone blades sharp enough to butcher animals. They hunted pygmy elephants, stegodon, creatures many times their size. They controlled fire. They may have constructed simple shelters. They lived in cooperative groups, sharing tasks and managing the dangers of a dangerous ecosystem. The site where they were found, Liang Bua Cave, is a cathedral of limestone, silent except for dripping water and fluttering bats. Within its dust and sediment, archaeologists discovered layers upon layers of occupation, tools, bones, ash, traces of a people so small yet so capable that their existence forced scientists to rewrite textbooks overnight. But how did such a small human species emerge? The leading theory is insular dwarfism, a phenomenon where large animals shrink when trapped on small islands with limited resources. On Flores, elephants became dwarfed, giant reptiles remained large, and humans, isolated by deep seas that even Ice Age climate could not bridge, shrank over thousands of generations. But another possibility lingers in the shadows. What if Homo floresiensis was not simply a dwarfed offshoot of Homo erectus? What if they belonged to an even older lineage, one that diverged from the human family tree long before the Neanderthals did? Some of their bone proportions suggest ancient, almost archaic traits. Their wrists resemble far older hominins. Their feet have a primitive anatomy, long and flat, more suited to climbing than running, and yet they had the intelligence to survive alongside predators and environmental catastrophes. The puzzle only deepens when we consider the timeline. Because Homo floresiensis did not vanish hundreds of thousands of years ago. They survived until at least 50,000 years ago, possibly even as recently as 40,000. This means one thing. Modern humans reached Southeast Asia while the small people were still alive. We met them. This possibility changes everything. It means that when our ancestors crossed the islands in their ocean voyages, they encountered not just wildlife, but another type of human, a tiny, tough, island-born survivor. What did that encounter look like? Did they hide? Did they avoid us? Did they see us as giants? Did they understand that we were human too? No one knows. But the timing is painfully narrow. Soon after modern humans arrived in the region, the traces of Homo floresiensis disappear from the archaeological record. The tools stop, the bones vanish, the presence fades. Was it competition? Was it climate change? Was it disease brought by our species? Or did our arrival disrupt their delicate balance with the island ecosystem? Some scientists, however, whisper another possibility, one that intertwines science with folklore in a way that feels almost forbidden. Because on Flores, the indigenous Nage people tell stories of small beings they call Ebu Gogo, short, hairy humans who lived in the forest, stole food, and mimicked human speech. These stories are not ancient myths. They persisted into the 19th century. Some villagers claim their grandparents saw them. When the remains of Homo floresiensis were announced, local elders reportedly said, "We know these beings. They were real. Are these legends coincidental? Or are they memories, cultural echoes of encounters with another human species? We cannot confirm, but the overlap is impossible to ignore." Flores was not the only island with a small-bodied human species. In 2019, another discovery shook the world: Homo luzonensis on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. Their bones, too, suggest a small-bodied people with a mosaic of ancient traits, and they, too, lived late into the Pleistocene. This raises questions that few dare to ask aloud. How many island species of humans existed that we have not yet found? How many skeletons have vanished in humid soil? How many islands once echoed with the footsteps of humans who were not us? And if these small humans lived so recently, could isolated pockets have survived even longer, their presence dissolved into oral traditions and lingering fears? The forests of Indonesia and the Philippines are vast, thick, nearly impenetrable. Even today, there are unexplored valleys, hidden caves, and deep ridges untouched for centuries. If a relic population survived into human memory, it would not be the first time an extinct species outlived its predicted timeline. But whether they survived past their archaeological end or not, their disappearance follows a pattern. One by one, the distinct species vanish from the fossil record around the same time that modern humans spread across the Earth. Coincidence or consequence? We are not looking at a single extinction event. We are looking at a cascade, species after species fading as our own expands. And yet, the story is far from finished, because while the small people of Flores and Luzon puzzle us with their size, another mystery lurks far beneath our feet. A mystery not of bones, but of genetics. A mystery involving a human species we have never found, but whose DNA flows quietly inside millions of us. A species older than Neanderthals, older than Denisovans, perhaps older than Homo sapiens itself, and their identity remains unknown. The last line still resonates like a quiet heartbeat in deep time. A species older than Neanderthals, older than Denisovans, perhaps older than Homo sapiens itself. And yet, we have never found their bones. To understand this, we must leave behind the caves and islands where fossils whisper their truths. We must turn inward, into the human genome, into the spiraling code of life that carries memories older than any artifact. Because inside our blood, hidden between thousands of genetic markers, there are signatures that do not match any known species. These signatures are not small anomalies. They are not trivial quirks. They are ancient footprints, genetic shadows left by beings we have never seen. Scientists call them ghost lineages, species that once lived, interbred, and influenced our evolution, yet left behind no fossils we have identified. And one of these ghost species, perhaps several, left their deepest marks in Africa. To explore this mystery, we must return to the cradle of humanity, a vast continent where climates shift like tides, where deserts bloom into grassland and grasslands vanish beneath forests, where human ancestry stretches backward further than anywhere else on Earth. Africa has always been the heart of our story, but its depth holds secrets we are only beginning to unravel. Modern DNA studies reveal that African populations, particularly those with deep ancestral continuity, carry genetic segments that cannot be explained by Homo sapiens alone, nor by Neanderthals, nor by Denisovans. These fragments are older, stranger. They diverged from our lineage long before any other known species. It is as if an ancient human species, one so old its origins may stretch nearly 1 million years into the past, left its genetic fingerprints in our ancestors. A silent inheritance passed through thousands of generations. But how can we know a species existed if we have never seen its bones? The answer lies in the patterns of DNA variation. Think of the genome as a tapestry woven from countless threads. Most of those threads trace back to known human lineages. But a few, long, distinct, unmistakably ancient, do not match anything in the fossil or genetic record. These threads look as though they came from a branch of the human family tree that split off before Neanderthals did, possibly before Homo heidelbergensis, possibly even before Homo erectus left Africa. And yet, these unknown humans did not vanish into isolation. They met our ancestors. They interbred with them. Their children survived. Some African populations today carry between 2 and 19% of their genome from these unidentified species, percentages far greater than Neanderthal legacy in Eurasia. This is not noise. This is ancestry. But where are their skeletons? Where are their tools? Where are their traces in the sands and caves of Africa? It is possible that we misidentified them, filed them under other species because we lacked the DNA to confirm their identity. It is possible their bones dissolved in tropical soils too acidic and humid to preserve ancient remains. It is possible they lived in regions that remain unexplored, in caves that collapsed, in valleys now buried under sediment. Or it is possible their remains are already in museum drawers, fragments labeled anomalous, ambiguous, uncertain. The African fossil record is vast but incomplete. There are thousands of years, thousands of regions, and thousands of individuals whose names we will never know. The ghost lineage may be hidden in plain sight. But what makes the mystery deeper still is that these unknown ancestors seem to have been more than one species. Genetic analysis points to at least 3 major ghost populations, all of which contributed DNA to early Homo sapiens in Africa. One extremely ancient lineage, older than 600,000 years. One intermediate lineage, related but distinct. And one much later lineage, possibly overlapping with early sapiens for thousands of years. Each one left a mark. Each one vanished without a trace. Each one reminds us that the human tree was not a straight line, but a sprawling forest of intertwined branches. So what were these beings like? Did they look human as we recognize the word? Did they walk upright? Did they hunt? Did they talk? Did they bury their dead? Did they have fire, tools, rituals? Or were they something more archaic, partly like us, partly like older hominins, carrying features that we might struggle to classify? We do not know. But their DNA gives hints. Some fragments influence immunity, suggesting they survived pathogens modern humans weren't prepared for. Some are linked to brain development, hinting at neural architectures subtly different from our own. Some affect metabolism, adaptations to climates, foods, or stresses no longer present today. These ghosts may have been taller or shorter. They may have been stronger or weaker. They may have lived in forests, savannas, deserts, or mountains. They may have been widespread or localized, or even nomadic. But the greatest clue is this: they were here for a very, very long time. Long enough to adapt to African ecosystems more deeply than any other species. Long enough to develop patterns of life we can only guess at. Long enough to interbreed with many waves of Homo sapiens, early, late, and everything in between. Their disappearance, like so many others, coincides with a crucial moment in history, the expansion of modern humans across Africa and beyond. But unlike Neanderthals or Denisovans, these ghost species vanish long before we reach the borders of Europe or Asia. Why? One explanation is simple: they were absorbed. Their identity dissolved into early sapiens through interbreeding. Another explanation is more complex. Climate change reshaped Africa repeatedly, pushing populations together or forcing them apart. Perhaps the ghost lineages dwindled due to shrinking habitats, competition for resources, or catastrophic droughts. And there is a third possibility, one that researchers mention only cautiously, one that blends science with speculation. What if early Homo sapiens, already developing symbolic thought, cooperative networks, and advanced tools, became competitively dominant? What if the earliest phases of the superorganism strategy were already unfolding in Africa? If so, then modern humans may have begun replacing or assimilating other human lineages long before the first contact with Neanderthals. This would mean that the pattern of disappearance we see outside Africa began much earlier than we realize. That extinction is not something triggered by our migration, but something born from our very nature. But the story grows even stranger, because some genetic signals are so ancient, so deep, so divergent, that they suggest we may be missing entire chapters of our ancestry. Species so old they diverged over 1 million years ago, and still somehow their DNA survived into the present. This is the paradox at the core of the human story. We are the last surviving human species, yet our blood is a mosaic of many. We are not alone in our origins. We never were. We carry memories of others, encoded in our cells like echoes of forgotten worlds. But even this is not the end of the mystery. Because if ghost species shaped us from within, then something else shaped us from without. Forces of nature so catastrophic that they wiped out entire ecosystems, destabilized entire continents, and forced human species to either evolve or disappear. Events so powerful that they reset the planet. Events our ancestors survived only by the narrowest margin. And one such event was approaching. The last words echo like distant thunder, and one such event was approaching. To understand what happened to the lost humans, why so many species vanished within the same narrow window, we must step into a time when the world itself seemed to turn against life. A time when Earth was not a passive stage for evolution, but an active force, reshaping climates, shifting habitats, and testing every species, including our own, with disasters so violent they bordered on extinction-level events. 40,000 years ago, the planet was already trembling under the weight of the Ice Age. Glaciers advanced and retreated like slow titans. Sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of feet. Forests expanded into open plains only to freeze a few centuries later. But near the heart of this instability, another force stirred, one that would ignite skies, poison landscapes, and trigger migrations that collided species again and again. This force came from deep within the Earth, volcanic fire. The late Pleistocene was marked by several massive eruptions, but one stands above all others like a giant's scream frozen in ash. The Toba supereruption, around 74,000 years ago, was one of the most catastrophic volcanic events in the last 2 million years. When Mount Toba exploded on the island of Sumatra, it hurled thousands of cubic kilometers of ash into the air, enough to blanket continents, enough to blot out the sun. Imagine a morning where the sky turns black. Imagine weeks of darkness. Imagine temperatures plummeting across the globe. Imagine crops failing, forests dying, herds migrating blindly, predators starving, prey collapsing, ecosystems shattering. Imagine human species living through this. The ash cloud spread from Southeast Asia to India, to the Middle East, to Africa. Rivers choked with sediment. Rain patterns shifted. Plants wilted. Animals froze in sudden cold snaps. Some scientists argue the eruption caused a global volcanic winter, plunging temperatures by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in some regions. Others believe the effects were more regional but still devastating. Either way, humanity felt it. Every species of humanity. For small-bodied island species like Homo floresiensis, the effects could have been catastrophic. Islands rely on delicate ecological balances. A sharp drop in temperature, a shift in rainfall, a disruption in plant life. These could collapse entire food chains. Even a small disturbance could push an isolated population toward extinction. For Eurasian species, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, the cold wasn't the problem. They were built for it. But the sudden environmental volatility shattered hunting patterns they relied on. Caribou disappeared from familiar ranges. Mammoths migrated unpredictably. Forests turned to dust fields. And for early Homo sapiens, the eruption was a crucible. Some genetic models suggest our population may have dropped dramatically, perhaps to fewer than 20,000 individuals, maybe even fewer. Whether this bottleneck was caused by Toba or by other stresses, the impact was real. Modern humans emerged from a period of scarcity and instability far more united, far more cooperative, far more dependent on symbolic communication and long-range networks networks than ever before. Crisis forged culture. But Toba was not the only disaster. During the same broad period, climate oscillations grew faster and more severe. The Earth lurched between cold and warm phases in decades instead of millennia. Rain patterns shifted across Africa, transforming lush grasslands into desolate plains. Rivers dried up, lakes expanded, then vanished. Every species of human was tested. Some adapted, some migrated, some interbred, some dwindled, some vanished. This is not a simple narrative of one species replacing another. This is the story of a world that almost ended again and again. And the pressures did not come only from nature. They came from within the ecosystem itself. As humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, sapiens, and others spread across landscapes stressed by climate and catastrophe, competition intensified. Hunting territories overlapped more often. Food supplies grew unreliable. Shelters became scarce. Rivers and lakes, once full of life, dried to cracked clay. Predators adapted to this new world with ruthless efficiency. Giant hyenas, cave lions, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats in their final epochs. Humans were not the rulers of this world. They were prey as often as predators. But in this crucible of chaos, early Homo sapiens began to do something different. They formed networks larger than any other species could maintain. They traded materials across distances measured not in miles, but in hundreds of miles. Shells from the Red Sea appear in sites far inland. Pigments from distant mountains appear across scattered settlements. Signs of communication, ideas spreading person to person, appear for the first time on continental scales. In an unstable world, we did not survive alone. We survived together. This is where the superorganism concept emerges. Slowly, subtly, modern humans began to act less like isolated bands and more like interconnected cells in a vast, shared cultural organism. Knowledge flowed between groups, symbols standardized, rituals emerged that tied clans together, alliances formed, stories carried warnings, lessons, myths, and strategies across generations. When crises struck, sapiens could relocate more easily. When food ran scarce, they could call on allies. When predators threatened, they could unite. When climate shifted, they could innovate. Other species adapted too, but their populations were smaller, their social networks narrower, their territories more constrained. In a world governed by instability, adaptability wasn't about strength or intelligence. It was about connection, and connection became our species' most potent advantage. As the Earth reeled under natural catastrophes, as ice advanced and retreated, as volcanic ash fell like gray snow, modern humans didn't just endure, they expanded. But expansion came with pressure. Pressure on food sources, pressure on territories, pressure on ecosystems that were already fragile. And every time modern humans entered a region already inhabited by another human species, the same pattern emerged: coexistence, contact, exchange, competition, retreat, absorption, extinction. The disasters of the late Pleistocene did not kill the other human species directly. They weakened them, shattered their populations, fragmented their territories, forced them into isolated pockets where survival depended on luck as much as adaptation. Modern humans, with their expanding networks and cultural firepower, filled the vacuum. The result was not a single extinction event, but a long cascade, 1,000 small endings, 1,000 disappearances, 1,000 quiet last breaths in caves and forests and mountains across the world. But the story does not end with destruction, because the same catastrophes that nearly ended humanity also forged something new, something powerful, something dangerous, something that would reshape the species that survived. The disasters forced Homo sapiens to think differently, to plan, to predict, to innovate, to imagine futures not yet real. to create symbols and stories that could guide their children long after the disasters had passed. It was here, in the shadow of catastrophe, that modern human cognition fully awakened. Catastrophe made us human, and that new humanity, imaginative, cooperative, symbolic, would soon reshape the world in ways no other species could withstand. The age of many humans was ending. The age of one human species was beginning. But there is one more piece of the puzzle, one force even stronger than disaster, even stronger than culture, even stronger than competition, a force hidden in the collective mind of modern humans, a force that changed everything, and that force was language. The last line hangs in the air like a spark before ignition. That force was language, not the vocabulary of modern cities or the polished rhythms of poetry, but something far more primal, far more powerful. To understand why only one human species survived, we must understand how Homo sapiens began wielding a tool that no other species, human or otherwise, ever mastered to the same degree. Because language didn't just let us communicate, language let us imagine. And imagination is evolution's most dangerous weapon. Picture the world before spoken symbols fully took shape. Neanderthals grunted, gestured, imitated, and likely had complex vocalizations. Denisovans surely had some form of communication. The anatomical evidence suggests they possessed the same vocal capabilities as their Neanderthal relatives. Even small-bodied species like Homo floresiensis may have had vocal structures that enabled more than simple calls. But whatever they possessed, whatever they used, was limited compared to the explosion of symbolic language that arose in early Homo sapiens. Language is not merely sound. It is structure. It is shared meaning. It is memory made eternal. It is the ability to say not only look behind you, but remember what happened last winter when the river fell. It is the ability to teach without demonstration, to plan without sight, to imagine without limit. Language allowed sapiens to carry knowledge across generations intact. It allowed warnings to travel beyond eyesight, beyond the horizon, beyond a single tribe's lifetime. It enabled cooperation on scales no other species could maintain. A hunting strategy perfected by one group could become a continental tradition. A myth developed by elders could shape the actions of children unborn. No other species had anything comparable, not in breadth, not in depth, not in collective power. And so language became the invisible architecture of our survival. But how did this happen? What changed in our ancestors' minds that did not change in the minds of Neanderthals or Denisovans? One theory suggests a mutation, something small, subtle, but transformative, affecting the FOXP2 gene associated with speech and language development. Neanderthals carried their own version of this gene, but associated regulatory sequences may have differed. Modern humans show variations that allow rapid, flexible learning of syntax and abstract grammar. A second theory points to social complexity. As Homo sapiens formed larger, more interconnected groups, communication became more elaborate. Rituals required precise timing. Alliances required negotiation. Stories required structure. Managing relationships beyond immediate kin required symbolic systems that held meaning even when the speaker was absent. Language bloomed because it had to, because the pressures of survival demanded it. A third theory, more poetic, less tangible, suggests that language did not arise from necessity alone, but from curiosity. That humans, even before they had full words, were sculpting meaning into sound simply because they could, because something in the sapiens' mind sought order, pattern, and narrative. Whatever the cause, the outcome was profound. While Neanderthals cooperated within small groups, Homo sapiens communicated across vast distances. While Denisovans adapted physically to high altitudes, sapiens adapted mentally to complexity. While small-bodied species mastered their islands, sapiens mastered imagination. This cognitive leap allowed our species to coordinate hunts involving dozens of individuals. It allowed food sharing between distant clans. It allowed early trade, not of goods, but of knowledge. When a plant proved poisonous, the story of its dangers traveled miles. When a predator learned new strategies, the information spread like wildfire. When a flood threatened a lowland camp, warnings passed through networks that stretched across landscapes. Language made sapiens unpredictable, dangerous, dynamic. It allowed us to change faster than evolution could. Tools improved from generation to generation not because of biology, but because of instruction. Weapons became standardized across regions. Art emerged. Symbols carved into bone, painted on cave walls, etched into rock. These weren't decorations. They were the early manifestations of a mind that could think in metaphor, myth, and memory. For other human species, this was a turning point and a turning threat. Imagine a Neanderthal clan watching Homo sapiens arrive in their valley. They would see taller, more graceful humans. Humans who moved quickly, who hunted in coordinated attacks, who seemed to share information without even speaking aloud. Glances, gestures, signals. Humans who made tools lighter, sharper, more disposable. Humans who carried stories with them. Neanderthals lived in smaller groups, with fewer individuals in each family band. Every death mattered. Every injury risked the survival of the clan. Their communication was efficient, but not expansive. Their culture was deep, but not cumulative on a large scale. When sapiens arrived, the difference was not brute strength. It was cognitive strategy. It was linguistic webbing. It was a mind that could translate experience into symbol, symbol into memory, memory into future. This did not lead to immediate conflict. In many cases, it may have led to curiosity, to cautious observation, to exchanges of knowledge, or even to interbreeding. But over time, the linguistic advantage of sapiens became a pressure as potent as climate or predation. The ability to coordinate large groups meant that sapiens could outhunt other species. The ability to maintain long-distance alliances meant greater stability in times of crisis. The ability to innovate rapidly meant new tools, new traps, new weapons. The ability to plan seasons ahead meant predictable food storage. The ability to create myths meant powerful social cohesion. While other species adapted physically, Homo sapiens adapted conceptually. Evolution had crafted many kinds of humans. But culture, fueled by language, reshaped sapiens into a force that evolution alone could not anticipate. Language also allowed something else, the formation of identity beyond the individual. Humans began to think of themselves as part of something bigger, tribes, clans, lineages. A sense of us and them may have emerged, not automatically hostile, but aware, protective, and cohesive. This wasn't aggression. It was belonging, and belonging becomes power. The linguistic world of sapiens grew into an invisible network overlaying the physical one. Ideas spread, merged, evolved, and grew. Tools that took Neanderthals centuries to refine became fluid in the hands of sapiens. Techniques passed from grandmother to granddaughter across dozens of generations with little loss of fidelity. And once language had transformed Homo sapiens into a cultural superorganism, the playing field was no longer level. But language didn't just change survival strategies. It changed psychology. It allowed storytelling, arguably the most important adaptation in the history of our species. Stories taught morality before laws existed. Stories taught caution before maps existed. Stories taught unity before nations existed. Stories taught memory before writing existed. And in a world of many human species, stories did something else. They carried knowledge of the others, myths of giants, myths of little people, myths of mountain spirits with human faces, myths of ancient beings who lived before humans. These stories may have been the final echoes of encounters long forgotten by archaeology, but not forgotten by human memory. Language preserved them. Language immortalized them. Language ensured that even after the other species vanished, their shadows remained. But while language was the invisible technology that reshaped the fate of all human species, it was not the final piece that secured Homo sapiens' dominance. Because language alone does not guarantee survival. Language alone does not make tools or fire or shelter. Language alone does not carry a tribe across famine or flood. Language fueled the rise of culture, but something else, something even deeper, would turn Homo sapiens into the final survivors of a world once filled with many kinds of humans. A trait so powerful, so adaptive, and so uniquely ours that it changed the destiny of every species it touched. That trait was imagination. The last line flickers like a torch igniting in darkness. That trait was imagination. Not the idle daydreaming we associate with quiet afternoons, but the most dangerous and transformative cognitive force the Earth has ever seen. To understand why only one human species survived, we must understand how Homo sapiens learned to see not only the world that existed, but the world that could exist. Imagination is not a luxury. Imagination is survival. Imagination is strategy made visible inside the mind. And somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, something changed within our species. Something so profound that anthropologists refer to it as the Great Leap, or the cognitive revolution. It was not a single moment, not a burst of genius, but a slow ignition of neural pathways that allowed our ancestors to think beyond the present, beyond the immediate, beyond the visible. Before imagination, all humans lived within the boundaries of instinct and reaction. But once imagination awakened, Homo sapiens transcended those boundaries forever. Imagine a Neanderthal hunter standing at the edge of a frozen forest. He sees the tracks of an animal. He follows them. He uses experience, instinct, and knowledge passed down through generations. Now imagine a Homo sapiens hunter. He sees the same tracks, but instead of simply reacting, he imagines. He envisions where the animal might go. He visualizes paths, outcomes, dangers, and opportunities. He creates a mental map of possibilities before they happen. This is imagination as survival. This is strategy not just of muscle, but of mind. Homo sapiens became the only animal capable of rehearsing the future. And once the future could be rehearsed, it could be shaped. Imagination became a weapon. With imagination, tools became inventions rather than inherited shapes. A spear was not just a sharpened stick. It became a long-distance weapon. A stone flake became part of a composite tool. Fire became something to control, store, transport, and manipulate. It wasn't the strength of sapient arms that changed the world. It was the mind that envisioned a new kind of weapon long before it was ever carved. Imagination led to innovations that no other human species adopted widely. Spear throwers, bows and arrows, traps that captured prey without risk, fishing hooks and nets, tailored clothing, constructed shelters, long-distance navigation across land and sea. Each invention was a leap, not just an improvement, but a transformation. And once an idea existed, it could spread through language, memory, and ritual until entire populations carried it forward. Innovation multiplied. Technology accelerated. Culture evolved. Imagination fueled a wildfire of creativity that reshaped survival itself. Neanderthals made tools. Denisovans made tools. Many species made tools. But only Homo sapiens made tools that changed over time. Innovation is not a physical ability, it's a cognitive storm. And that storm gathered inside our species alone. Imagination created meaning. While imagination allowed Homo sapiens to alter the physical world, it also reshaped the symbolic world. It birthed something no other species practiced at the same depth: art. Before art, the world was merely functional. After art, the world became a canvas for thought. On cave walls across Africa, 100,000-year-old engravings showed deliberate geometry, lines, crosshatches, patterns that meant something to the people who carved them. In Blombos Cave, pieces of ochre were etched with symbols. In Apollo 11 cave, stone slabs were painted with animal shapes. In Pinnacle Point, people collected pigments from distant cliffs, colors used not for hunting, but for expression. This was not survival. This was identity. This was self-awareness, written in mineral and bone. And when sapiens carried art into Europe, the echoes became thunderous. In the caves of Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira, paintings exploded across the walls, bison, lions, mammoths, horses, depicted with such realism and movement that they almost breathe. These images were not decoration. They were imagination manifested in ritual, spirit, and myth. Neanderthals painted, but rarely. Other species used pigments, but sparingly. Only sapiens turned art into a language of the soul. Imagination built social reality. Imagination allowed Homo sapiens to create invisible systems, shared beliefs, identities, and rules that existed only in the collective mind. This is where myths emerge. This is where spirituality awakens. This is where ritual deepens. This is where meaning becomes a tool of cohesion. Anthropologists argue that imagination enabled early humans to invent stories that unified groups, create totems, kinship symbols, and clan identities, develop spiritual rituals that strengthened loyalty, form alliances rooted not in blood, but in belief, envision ancestors and heroes, create oral traditions that preserved wisdom. While other species cooperated within small family units, Homo sapiens cooperated across vast social networks. Imagination built tribes. Imagination built alliances. Imagination built trust between strangers. A shared myth could bind hundreds. A shared ritual could unite thousands. And a shared identity could mobilize entire populations long before the word civilization ever existed. This was not religion as we know it today. This was the first emergence of symbolic unity, and unity became power. Imagination carved the first maps. To imagine is to visualize. To visualize is to plan. To plan is to explore. Homo sapiens began crossing environments no other human species dared to enter. Tropical rainforests, savanna floodplains, high mountains, coastal cliff networks, open deserts, and eventually, the open ocean. 40 to 60,000 years ago, sapiens reached Australia by boat, not by accident, not by drifting logs, by intentional seafaring. This act alone demonstrates imagination at its peak. A boat must be built before the ocean is seen. A journey must be imagined before it is taken. A destination must exist in the mind before it exists in reality. No other human species ever crossed open oceans deliberately. This feat did not require a single genius. It required collective imagination. It required communication. It required planning. It required trust. It required a new kind of mind. Imagination could kill. Imagination is creativity, but it is also weaponry. Once humans imagined tools, they imagined better tools. Once they imagined cooperation, they imagined strategy. Once they imagined groups, they imagined enemies. This is the uncomfortable truth buried beneath archaeology. The ability to imagine may have given our species the capacity for organized violence at scales no other human lineage could match. Not brutality, not senseless killing, but planned conflict, carried out by coordinated groups who could communicate, strategize, and adapt. There is no proof of ancient genocide. No clear battlefield remains, but patterns suggest something indirect but devastating. Where Homo sapiens expanded, other species declined. Not instantly, not universally, but gradually, consistently, irreversibly. Was this due to conflict, competition, resource pressure, disease, cultural superiority, or imagination itself? Perhaps all of the above. We do not have the bones of battle. We do not have clear evidence of war, but we have the aftermath. Other species do not just fade, they disappear, and we remain. Imagination ensured our survival at their expense. By 40,000 years ago, the mind of Homo sapiens had become a force of nature. Language plus imagination produced an unstoppable combination: the ability to plan collectively, the ability to innovate rapidly, the ability to envision winter before winter came, the ability to survive where others could not, the ability to migrate across impossible distances, the ability to create meaning that held groups together, the ability to adapt to disasters, predators, and ecological collapse. Imagination did not just improve survival metaphorically, it altered it literally. This was the tipping point. This was the moment when sapiens were no longer just another human species. This was when the age of many humans shifted into the age of one. But this rise, this triumph of imagination, came with a cost written in extinction, a cost written in silence, a cost written in the disappearance of every other branch of the human tree. Because imagination does not stop. Imagination grows. Imagination consumes. Imagination dominates. And the next chapter of this story will reveal the final, irreversible process that ended the era of many humans and began the age of Homo sapiens alone. A process not driven by violence, not driven by disaster, but driven by something subtler, deeper, and far more profound. The merging of worlds as human species collided, blended, and vanished into us. The last thought still glows softly. The merging of worlds as human species collided, blended, and vanished into us. To understand how this merging happened, we must look at our origins not as a triumphant ascent, but as an inheritance built from the disappearance of others. Because when the age of many humans ended, it did not end in fire or blood alone. It ended in something far more complex, far more intimate, and far more permanent. It ended in absorption. The idea may feel uncomfortable, even unsettling, but the truth is simple. We are not pure. No human alive today is purely Homo sapiens in the isolated textbook sense. Instead, every one of us carries echoes, fragments, and whispers of ancient humans who no longer walk the earth. The Neanderthals are in us. The Denisovans are in us. Ghost lineages from Africa flow in our veins. We are mosaics, not monoliths. And this mosaic did not form overnight. It formed through thousands of years of contact, migration, partnership, conflict, avoidance, union, and extinction. When Homo sapiens expanded across continents, we did not encounter empty lands. Every region had its guardians, its specialists, its long-rooted inhabitants who had adapted to their environment for hundreds of thousands of years. The Neanderthals had Europe and Western Asia. The Denisovans held the mountains and forests of the East. The small-bodied humans thrived on distant islands. The ghost species shaped Africa's deep genealogies. To meet these species was not simply a crossing of paths. It was a collision of worlds. Imagine that collision. A Neanderthal child watching unfamiliar figures approach across a valley, their footsteps lighter, their tools smaller but sharper, their clothing more intricate, their faces narrower, their voices carrying strange rhythms across the air. What did that child feel? Curiosity? Fear? Recognition? A sense that these beings were like them, and yet not like them at all. Or imagine a Denisovan hunter tracking prey through a frozen pass. He sees footprints in the snow that do not match any he knows. Not animals, not his own kind. The prints are narrower, lighter, more frequent, more numerous. A sign of a group that travels far and fast. He follows them, not knowing that this moment marks the beginning of the end for his kind. These encounters were not cinematic battles. They were small interactions at first. A shared water source, a stolen carcass from a hunt, a cautious observation from a distance, a trade of tools, a gesture across the firelight of a temporary refuge. And then, inevitably, there were unions. Rare, but powerful. A Neanderthal woman and a sapiens man. A Denisovan man and a sapiens woman, a meeting of loneliness, curiosity, necessity, or accident. A child born with a mixed heritage, a child who would become a link between species, a child who would carry forward a legacy none of them could imagine. These children did not belong to only one world. They belonged to two, and through them, worlds merged. Modern humans did not spread through clean replacement. They spread through blending. And as they blended, they absorbed. And as they absorbed, the older species faded, slowly, quietly, until only their genetic traces remained. This is the paradox of our existence. We are the last human species, but we are also the sum of all human species. Neanderthals gave us immunity. Denisovans gave us physical adaptations. Ghost ancestors gave us genetic diversity older than recorded history. Their disappearance is our inheritance. But why did they disappear fully while we survived? Why did their names become whispers, while ours became the last chapter of human evolution? The answer lies in the combination of three forces that converged within Homo sapiens like a perfect storm: connection, imagination, and adaptability. Connection allowed us to form large, stable, culturally linked networks that no other species could match. Imagination allowed us to envision possibilities and futures that other species could not see. Adaptability allowed us to thrive from deserts to mountains to tundra, from islands to steppes to forests. When crises struck, these traits merged. When climates shifted, these traits merged. When contact occurred, these traits merged. And each merging reinforced the same outcome: the slow retreat of every other human species. But the retreat was not always violent. Many disappeared through simply having too few children, too few opportunities for survival, too few groups to sustain their numbers, too few allies in a world reshaped by climate and competition. Some merged so completely into sapiens bloodlines that they ceased to exist as separate species long before their final bones were laid into the earth. This is the subtlety often missed. Extinction is not always destruction. Extinction can be absorption. Extinction can be merging into another lineage until identity itself dissolves. Even Neanderthals, the most famous of our ancient cousins, lived alongside us for thousands of years before their final disappearance. Some regions show alternating habitation between Neanderthals and sapiens, like a slow dance of presence and absence. But eventually, the sapient presence grew too strong, too consistent, too connected, and Neanderthals became fewer. Each generation smaller, each winter harsher, each contact more consequential. Denisovans likely followed the same pattern, though their remains are too few to map clearly. Their end was not dramatic. It was gradual, quiet, a fading into the shadows of the mountains they once ruled. The small-bodied humans, such as those on Flores and Luzon, may have fared even worse. Their populations were tiny, their ecosystems fragile. A volcanic eruption, a shift in rainfall, a new predator, or the arrival of modern humans could disrupt everything. They survived for tens of thousands of years until even a slight imbalance pushed them toward disappearance. The ghost lineages of Africa likely dissolved even earlier, merging into the ancestors of our species so fully that only rare genetic fragments remain to tell their story. Everywhere sapiens expanded, the pattern repeated. Not instantly, not universally, but inevitably. This is not a story of superiority. It is a story of capacity. It is a story of a species whose mind evolved in ways others did not. It is a story of networks stronger than borders. It is a story of imagination stronger than muscle. It is a story of a world that could no longer hold many types of humans once one type learned to see beyond the horizon. And so the merging continued, until only one human species remained. But the merging had another consequence, a deeper one that echoes even today in our dreams, our myths, our fears, and our sense of longing for worlds we never knew. Because as other species disappeared physically, something else happened psychologically. Their presence lingered in memory, in story, in superstition. Ancient humans told tales of giants, of small forest people, of mountain spirits, of beings who lived alongside us and then vanished. These stories survived the extinction of their subjects. They transformed into legends. They became the foundations of mythology around the world. And perhaps this is the final merging. The merging not of blood, but of memory. A merging where extinct species live on not only in genetics, but in the human imagination they helped shape. But one question remains, one more profound than all the rest. If every other human species vanished through extinction or absorption, what does that mean about us? What does it mean to be the last? The next chapter will explore that question, a question that reaches into the heart of what makes us human today. Because to understand why we survived, we must understand the deepest fear and deepest destiny of modern humans. The knowledge that we stand alone because others walked beside us once, and now they do not. The age of many humans ended, but the age of the last humans was only beginning. And that final age carries a burden we still feel today. The last line still flickers like an ember in the dark. The age of many humans ended, and the age of the last humans was only beginning. But stepping into that age is not a triumphal march. It is a story filled with loneliness, memory, and the quiet understanding that our survival came at the cost of an entire world of human diversity. To grasp what it meant to become the final human species, we must imagine the moment when the last fires of other humans went dark. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, one cave at a time, one valley at a time, one lineage at a time. Picture a Neanderthal camp in the foothills of a cold mountain range. Winter grips the land. The wind slices across the snow. Inside a cave, a small group huddles around a dying fire. Their numbers are few, too few. A child coughs. Two elders rest with shallow breaths. A young hunter stares into the flame as if searching for answers hidden in the orange glow. They do not know they are the last. They do not know that their kind will soon vanish. They only know that the world has changed around them, and they are struggling to keep pace. Far to the east, in a mountainous forest where pine trees sway under heavy frost, a Denisovan group follows the trail of a migrating herd. They are strong, tall, adapted to cold and altitude. Their lungs, their blood, their bones are tuned to this harsh world. But the herd moves in new patterns. The climate shifts unpredictably. Rival species wander into their hunting grounds, and the group finds fewer resources each year. They do not know that the genes they carry will survive only through the children they leave with Homo sapiens. They do not know they will fade without a trace in the archaeological record. They only know hunger is growing, and each winter grows longer. In a distant island cave, a small-bodied human stands on a rocky ledge overlooking the sea. The waves crash against the cliffs. The jungle murmurs behind him. He is part of a people who once thrived here, but their numbers have dwindled after storms, food shortages, and the arrival of tall strangers with unfamiliar voices and tools. He does not know that he belongs to a species soon to be discovered only by bones. He does not know that he may be witnessing the final sunset of his kind. He only knows the horizon feels different than before, as if the world is preparing to turn a page he cannot read. Across Africa, ghost lineages of deep ancestry dissolve the same way. No dramatic ending, no final battle, just gradual disappearance as early Homo sapiens rises in complexity, number, and reach. This is extinction, not as catastrophe, but as fading. And what makes this fading so haunting is that Homo sapiens was watching it, feeling it, and perhaps even understanding it on some level. Because as we moved across the world, as our networks expanded, as our cultures deepened, we were not blind to the existence of the others. We saw them. We encountered them. We shaped our myths and fears around them. For tens of thousands of years, humans were not alone. We shared the world with other beings who were like us and not like us. Other beings who hunted, laughed, mourned, created, fought, and dreamed. Other beings who had firelight, tools, families, and memories. Imagine the psychological shock of encountering another type of human for the first time. A figure that walks upright, a face with eyes and expression, a voice with rhythm, a mind with intention, yet undeniably different. Modern humans must have felt awe, must have felt fear, must have felt curiosity, and when the others began to disappear, early Homo sapiens must have felt something else too, a sense of mystery, a sense of loss, a sense of destiny. Stories began to form in the minds of early humans. Stories of beings older than lightning. Stories of giants who stalked the frozen plains. Stories of little forest people who whispered in the night. Stories of mountain spirits whose eyes glowed in the dark. Stories of ancestors who lived before humanity. These stories didn't arise from imagination alone. They arose from memory. Memory of a world with many humans. Memory of encounters carved into the collective psyche of our species. Memory of faces we no longer see but once recognized. In the firelit nights of early sapiens camps, elders must have spoken of the others. They must have described the people who lived in the next valley, the people who looked different, the people with great strength, the people with strange voices, the people who left footprints in the snow but kept their distance, the people who once lived here and now do not. These stories passed across generations, and as time stretched on, as the other species vanished completely, the stories changed. They became myths. Myths became legends. Legends became echoes, and echoes became the seeds of universal archetypes, the giants in ancient stories, the little people of forest folklore, the mountain guardians of early civilizations, the ancient beings of the underworld, the sky spirits who shaped humanity, the races that walked before humans. These archetypes appear on every continent, in every culture, in every era, and perhaps their roots lie not only in imagination, but in ancestral memory of real encounters. But what did it feel like when the others were finally gone? What did it mean for Homo sapiens to stand alone? Loneliness may have settled into the species in ways we do not consciously understand. For thousands of years, humanity existed in plural form. Not one humanity, but many humanities. Different shapes, different abilities, different origins, different minds. When the others disappeared, Homo sapiens became the last ember of a once roaring evolutionary fire. And with that status came a psychological burden our species still carries. The burden of being the only surviving branch of a once diverse family. The burden of knowing, deep within, that we were not always alone. The burden of myths that whisper of ancient neighbors whose shadows never fully faded. This loneliness may be why humans so consistently imagine other beings like ourselves, not animals, not monsters, but humans that are not humans, other species, other minds, other people. We fill our stories with them. We fill our religions with them. We fill our fears with them. We fill our hopes with them. Perhaps we do this because our ancestors lived through a time when those beings were real. The final firelight of the other species went out tens of thousands of years ago, but the glow remains in our memory. The echo remains in our genes. The stories remain in our myths. The longing remains in our imagination. And as the last humans stepped into a world without rivals, the destiny of our species shifted permanently. Because now, for the first time, Homo sapiens had no one to look to for comparison, no alternate version of themselves walking the earth. We became the only mirror. We became the only possibility. We became the only future. But being the last human species did not make us safe. It made us responsible for a world reshaped by our presence, responsible for the legacy of those who vanished, responsible for the direction of humanity after the age of many humans ended. And to understand that responsibility, we must follow Homo sapiens into the next phase of their story, a phase where culture explodes, a phase where creativity intensifies, a phase where identity deepens, a phase where survival becomes meaning. Because the disappearance of the others did not mark the end of the human story. It marked the beginning of something far more complex. It marked the rise of the human world. What comes next is the dawn of art, myth, ritual, and identity on a scale never seen before. A dawn that would permanently separate us from all species who came before. a dawn that defined what it means to be human today. And that dawn begins now. The last line lingers like the first glow of sunrise. The dawn that defined what it means to be human begins now. To understand what happened after we became the last human species, we must follow the early Homo sapiens as they spread across continents not simply as survivors, but as world builders. Because once the others disappeared, a transformation began within our species that reshaped everything. Not just how we lived, but how we thought. Not just how we survived, but how we imagined. For tens of thousands of years before this turning point, human brains were capable of complex thought. We know this from the tools, the pigments, the burial practices. But something changed around 40 to 30,000 years ago. Something shifted deep within the human mind. A cognitive ignition, a cultural detonation. This transformation is visible not in bones, but in symbols. Not in tools alone, but in the stories those tools tell. It was the dawn of human worlds. Because humans did not merely live in landscapes. We built worlds inside our minds and then projected them onto the environment. We began to reshape reality through meaning, and meaning became a force as real as any predator or storm. Imagine a small group of early Homo sapiens traveling along a riverbank at dusk. Their footsteps crunch over gravel. The sky glows orange. The wind carries the scent of distant rain. As they walk, one of them picks up a smooth stone, examines it, scratches a symbol onto its surface with another stone, and leaves it behind. That symbol means something to them. A warning, perhaps. A message. A memory. A sign for others. Now imagine the next group finding it, recognizing it, understanding it. In that moment, the physical world became layered with invisible meaning. Landmarks became sacred, rivers gained stories, mountains became ancestors, animals became symbols, dreams became messages, life became narrative. The world transformed from a place of survival to a place of imagination. This shift marks the beginning of what anthropologists call symbolic culture. But symbolic culture is more than art or language. It is the birth of collective identity. Before this dawn, early humans lived in clusters tied by necessity and kinship. After this dawn, they lived in societies tied by belief, memory, tradition, and imagination. And that transformed everything. This new symbolic world manifested in several astonishing ways. The first was art, not simple markings, but immersive expression. In European caves like Lascaux and Chauvet, humans painted animals in motion. The paintings were not random decorations. They were deliberate creations of shape and shadow, using natural pigments in ways that mimic movement and perspective. Firelight would make the animals seem alive. This was early animation, long before the concept existed. These paintings were not the work of solitary individuals. They required group coordination, shared knowledge, ritual preparation, and possibly spiritual belief. They required a world behind the world. Meanwhile, in Africa, humans created some of the earliest abstract engravings, necklaces made of shells transported from distant coasts, beads shaped from ostrich eggshells, and pigments collected from far lands. In Asia, humans carved figurines from mammoth ivory, creatures, spirits, ancestors. In Australia, they painted on cliffs in styles that still echo through indigenous art today. Everywhere Homo sapiens went, symbols erupted like wildflowers. Symbols were not entertainment. Symbols were identity. Symbols were unity. Symbols were power. The second manifestation of this new human world was ritual. Rituals brought communities together in ways that transcended bloodlines. Gatherings around firelight, initiation ceremonies, death rites, seasonal celebrations, animal dances, healing rituals, song cycles. Each one helped forge bonds that made social groups stronger, larger, and more resilient than anything other human species had constructed. Ritual created a shared emotional reality. The third manifestation was spirituality. Humans began to sense the unseen, to wonder about forces behind weather, behind life, behind death. to imagine spirits in the wind, ancestors in the stars, messages in dreams. This was not superstition. This was a psychological tool for endurance. Spiritual belief helped humans confront fear. It helped them cope with loneliness, uncertainty, pain, and loss. It gave them cohesion during crises. It gave them hope. Other human species may have had glimmers of spirituality, but Homo sapiens embedded it deeply into daily life. Spirituality became a bond, a language without words. The fourth transformation was social expansion. Neanderthals lived in groups of 10 to maybe 30 individuals. Denisovans likely lived in similar small clusters. But Homo sapiens began forming networks of hundreds. These networks were not cities, but extended communities connected by trade, marriage, ritual, and shared memory. This meant that even in times of disease, trauma, famine, or migration, sapiens could rely on distant allies. No other species had that. The fifth change was innovation. Tools became more complex. Hunting strategies became more sophisticated. Spears evolved into spear throwers. Spear throwers evolved into bows. Clothing was tailored with bone needles. Homes became more elaborate. Food preservation improved through smoking, drying, and fermenting. Navigation expanded. Fishing techniques diversified. Fire manipulation advanced. Innovation accelerated because imagination fueled it, and language shared it. A new world emerged, a human-made world, and this world grew in complexity until it overshadowed every other human species. For tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals and Denisovans existed without such explosive cultural change. Their intelligence was undeniable, their adaptation remarkable, but their cultural growth was slow and stable. They lived in a deep rhythm with their environments. Homo sapiens disrupted that rhythm. With imagination, sapiens reshaped landscapes. With language, they reshaped social structures. With culture, they reshaped cognition. With identity, they reshaped the meaning of existence itself. This change rippled outward across every continent we entered. It altered hunting grounds. It altered ecosystems. It altered relationships between humans and animals. It altered the fates of species who stood beside us. By the time we entered Western Europe, the symbolic explosion was fully underway, and the Neanderthals, caught in the wake of this cultural surge, faced a world changing faster than they could adapt. Some Neanderthal groups adopted sapiens tools, some adopted ornaments, some showed signs of social imitation, but these adaptations were late, and the pressure was immense. Human worlds were expanding. Neanderthal worlds were shrinking. The same pattern unfolded in Asia with the Denisovans, though their archaeological record is thinner. And on islands like Flores, small-bodied species faced the arrival of humans with tools and strategies they had never seen. The dawn of human worlds was not gentle. It reshaped everything, and it came with consequences. Because once humans built inner worlds, they also built outer ones, through migration, innovation, and imagination that pushed deeper and farther with each passing generation. This period marks the dawn of spiritual consciousness, artistic expression, collective identity, and technological ingenuity. It marks the beginning of who we are today, but it also marks the beginning of something else, something darker, something more powerful than imagination or language alone. Because once humans built worlds in their minds, they began to reshape the entire planet to match those worlds. And that power had a cost the other human species could not pay. This next chapter will reveal a truth both profound and unsettling. The rise of Homo sapiens was not simply the triumph of intelligence. It was the triumph of imagination over reality, a triumph that made us human, and a triumph that left us alone. The next block will explore how humans began transforming nature itself, and how that transformation sealed the fate of every other human species that once walked beside us. The last line still resonates. The rise of Homo sapiens was the triumph of imagination over reality. Now, to understand how this triumph reshaped the destiny of every other human species, we must follow sapiens as they moved through the world like a quiet storm, transforming everything they touched. Because once humans began building inner worlds, they began reshaping the outer world to match them. Landscapes changed, ecosystems shifted, predator-prey cycles collapsed. Entire regions reorganized themselves around the presence of a single species with an unprecedented ability to adapt, cooperate, and innovate. This is where the age of human influence truly began. Long before agriculture, long before cities, long before recorded history. And in that transformation, the other human species found themselves facing pressures unlike anything in their evolutionary past. Imagine the scene. A group of early sapiens arrives in a valley where Neanderthals have lived for thousands of years. The Neanderthals know every cave, every trail, every water source. Their ancestors have walked this valley since long before sapiens even existed. But the sapiens who arrive do not simply occupy the land, they reshape it. They build temporary camps that shift with the seasons. They track herds across wide distances instead of staying anchored to one place. They cooperate across larger networks, sharing information gathered from far away, and they hunt differently. Sapiens hunt not just with spears, but with strategy, coordination, traps, projectiles, and long-range communication. Neanderthals were ambush predators, powerful and precise. Sapiens were pursuit predators, strategic and relentless. A valley that once supported one species now must support two. Food becomes contested, territory becomes contested, shelter becomes contested. But sapiens bring something Neanderthals do not: sheer adaptability. If the valley yields little, sapiens move. If the seasons shift, sapiens shift with them. If food becomes scarce, sapiens call on distant allies. If predators adapt, sapiens innovate. Neanderthals, despite their extraordinary resilience, remain tied to smaller populations and narrower social networks. Their strategies are optimized for stability, not unpredictability, and the world in this era was nothing if not unpredictable. The same dynamic unfolds across Asia with the Denisovans. In the mountains where oxygen thins and cold thickens, Denisovans had thrived for tens of thousands of years. Their bodies were adapted to altitude in ways even sapiens had to borrow through interbreeding. But sapiens did not need perfect bodies. They had perfect creativity. If thin air threatened them, they found new patterns of breathing, new rhythms of rest, new camp structures, new cooperation strategies. If cold threatened them, they improved clothing, refined fire control, built shelters that trapped heat. Denisovans adapted through blood and bone. Sapiens adapted through ideas. That difference made all the difference. The same story repeats in every region. In each case, Homo sapiens enter ecosystems shaped by other humans, but instead of fitting into them, sapiens reconfigure them. We are used to thinking of the Anthropocene, the age of human alteration of the planet, as beginning with agriculture or industrialization. But in truth, its seeds were planted far earlier. When sapiens first arrived in Australia, megafauna began to die out. Massive marsupials, giant birds, enormous reptiles. Not overnight, but steadily, as humans altered hunting patterns, burned landscapes to attract prey, and reorganized ecosystems through selective pressure. The same pattern appears in Siberia, in the Americas, in Europe, in island chains across the globe. Large animals vanish not instantly, but predictably. Human presence changes everything. But what does this have to do with the disappearance of the other human species? Everything. Because the other species were specialists. Neanderthals specialized in cold climates and large game. Denisovans specialized in altitude and endurance. Small-bodied species specialized in island ecologies. Ghost lineages specialized in certain African landscapes. Homo sapiens were not specialists. We were universalists. Wherever we went, we adjusted. We did not rely on one environment or one strategy. We shifted our behavior rather than waiting for evolution to slowly modify our bodies. This adaptability created a ripple effect across the natural world. Ecosystems strained, resources strained, territory strained, social dynamics strained. For the other species, whose evolution was tied to stable rhythms and local knowledge, this new pressure was overwhelming. Imagine a Denisovan group watching the arrival of sapiens. They see a species that hunts differently, eats differently, travels differently. A species that does not respect the old boundaries. A species that does not remain fixed in one niche. A species that changes the rules of survival itself. Imagine how destabilizing that must have been, even without conflict. Or imagine the small humans on Flores or Luzon. Their entire survival depended on the balance of their island ecosystems. One new predator or competitor could tip the scales. One shift in food supply could collapse the system. And Homo sapiens were more than one shift. They were dozens. We introduced new hunting patterns. We introduced new fire patterns. We introduced new mobility patterns. We introduced cultural speed that small populations could not match. Humans did not set out to destroy these species, but destruction does not require intention. Sometimes destruction is simply the byproduct of existing with more adaptability than the world can absorb. To be adaptable is to be disruptive. To be disruptive is to be transformative. To be transformative is to leave others behind. This is the quiet truth of the early Anthropocene. Not machinery, not industry, not civilization, but presence, movement, cooperation, imagination. These things alone reshaped the world. Every time a Homo sapiens group migrated, the balance of life shifted. Every time we shared new tools, the ecology shifted. Every time we built new alliances, the landscape of survival shifted. In this shifting world, non-sapiens humans found themselves cornered by change itself. Some merged with us. Some retreated to harsher territories. Some hung on for thousands of years in shrinking refugees. Some survived long enough to leave descendants in our genomes, but not in their own. Eventually, the world we were shaping became a world that only we could thrive in. A world optimized for the kind of mind that sees possibilities instead of fixed boundaries. A world shaped by stories, strategies, and images carried in the mind. A world built for expansion, not isolation. But becoming the last human species was not victory. It was responsibility. It was inheritance. It was burden. And as we moved deeper into the world we were reshaping, something else began to happen. Our own identity began to evolve. Our own communities grew larger. Our own myths grew deeper. Our own sense of past and future sharpened. The world was no longer merely a place to survive. It became a place to understand, to shape, to pass on, to inhabit with meaning. The age of survival was ending. The age of human perspective was beginning. But before this transformation could reach its full expression, something had to change inside us. Something profound, something permanent. We had to understand ourselves not only as individuals, not only as tribes, but as a species. And the moment that shift occurred, the human story entered a new chapter. A chapter defined by identity, a chapter shaped by memory, a chapter marked by responsibility for a world no longer shared with others like us. The next block will explore this metamorphosis, the rise of self-awareness in Homo sapiens, not as animals, not as survivors, but as the last humans. A realization that would shape our myths, our fears, our purpose, and the path of our species from that moment to this very day. The last line hangs in the air like the breath before revelation, the rise of self-awareness in Homo sapiens as the last humans. To understand how this transformation unfolded, we must walk into a moment that is not recorded in fossils or artifacts, but in something deeper, the human mind, as it stood on the threshold of realizing, perhaps for the very first time, that it was alone. Because somewhere between 40,000 and 20,000 years ago, an idea began to spread through Homo sapiens communities. Not an idea spoken in a single sentence, Not an idea written in symbols yet, not a doctrine or law, but a quiet understanding shared across firelight and across generations. We are the only ones left. This realization did not come suddenly. It emerged gradually, rippling outward from region to region as the presence of other humans faded from memory. In Europe, the last Neanderthal camps dimmed, their fires extinguished by time. In the mountains of Siberia, the Denisovans vanished into genetic echoes. In the forests and islands of Southeast Asia, the small-bodied humans disappeared without a trace. In Africa, the ghost lineages dissolved into us so subtly that only DNA still recalls their existence. For thousands of years, Homo sapiens had lived among others, not always beside them, not always in direct contact, but aware of them, sensing their presence, marking their territories, hearing stories about them. Other humans were not distant myths. They were part of the living world. But as time passed, those stories began to change. The sightings stopped. The footprints faded. The territories became empty of familiar shapes. The voices that once echoed in distant valleys no longer returned calls. The bones that remained in the soil were bleached and silent. One by one, the others became memories, and memories became myths. And myths became the first signs of something new. Human self-awareness on a scale no species had ever needed before. To be the last is not simply a biological fact. It is a psychological shift, a turning inward, a sense of uniqueness that can feel like destiny or like burden. For the first time in existence, Homo sapiens had no peers, no mirrors, no rivals, no alternate versions of themselves walking the plains or the mountains or the forests. We became the reference point for all meaning, and that changed us. Imagine a small camp of Homo sapiens in a grassy valley during the late Ice Age. The cold wind rolls across the plain. Mammoth herds wander in the distance. A group sits around a fire, their faces illuminated by orange light. An elder tells a story about a time when the people with heavy brows used to travel through this valley. He describes their size, their strength, their strange voices. The young ones listen with fascination, but they have never seen such beings. To them, the elder might as well be speaking of spirits or giants or beings from dreams. This is how history becomes myth. This is how memory becomes story. This is how reality becomes legend. And once the legends form, the idea begins to take shape within the collective mind of our species. We are different. We are alone. We are the last. What does it mean to be the last? To stand where thousands of generations once stood together. To inherit a world carved by the footsteps of many kinds of humans, yet to walk it alone. This realization reshaped Homo sapiens in several profound ways. First, it strengthened social bonds. Communities that once defined themselves in contrast to other human species now defined themselves in relation to each other. Tribal identity grew stronger. Cultural differences grew sharper. Clans, lineages, rituals, and shared myths gained deeper meaning. Because when no other humans remained, the distinctions within our own species became the new boundaries of identity. Second, it intensified symbolic expression. Art became more elaborate. Cave paintings grew grander. Burial rituals became more complex. Personal ornaments became more common. Humans began marking their world with symbols that declared, "We are here." The symbolic explosion we see in archaeology during this period is not coincidence. It reflects a species becoming aware of itself as the final witness of a world once shared. Third, it enhanced the human relationship with memory. Memory became lineage. Memory became story. Memory became legacy. We began to preserve the past not only for survival, but for meaning. We carried forward the stories of ancestors, spirits, gods, and creatures that lived before us. These stories, in one way or another, preserved the echoes of the other human species long after their bones turned to dust. Fourth, it sharpened the human perception of time. Humans began thinking in terms of generations, thinking in terms of ancestors and descendants, thinking in terms of long arcs rather than immediate survival. This temporal expansion of thought is part of what allowed humans to build the foundations of civilization thousands of years later. But there is a fifth transformation, one that is rarely discussed in scientific circles, but deeply embedded in human psychology, mythology, and spirituality. It is the feeling of being watched by the past. When Homo sapiens became the last humans, the world did not feel empty. It felt haunted, not by ghosts in the supernatural sense, but by the awareness that others once walked these same lands. Others hunted these animals. Others painted these caves. Others sang to the moon before we did. This haunting is not fear. It is a sense of inheritance, a sense of responsibility, a sense of connection to beings we cannot name, but whose presence still affects us. Even today, when people speak of ancient giants, forest spirits, mountain guardians, or star ancestors, they may be echoing memories formed during the time when Homo sapiens realized it stood alone. The disappearance of the other species created a psychological vacuum that humanity filled with imagination, myth, and meaning. It is not a coincidence that the earliest widespread spiritual practices flourish soon after the other species vanish. Spirituality, in many ways, became a bridge between what was lost and what remained, a way for humans to make sense of a world where familiar shapes had disappeared. The earth felt empty, the sky felt larger, the mind reached for connection. This is the moment humanity began asking questions about origin, destiny, identity, and purpose. Questions no other species needed to ask. Questions sparked by the experience of being the last. The early human mind, shaped by the disappearance of its cousins, began seeking answers in the unseen. And from this seeking came the seeds of religion, philosophy, cosmology, and eventually science. But these transformations were not uniform across all Homo sapiens communities. Different groups experienced the disappearance of other humans in different ways. In Europe, memory of Neanderthals lingered longest. In Asia, hints of Denisovans survived in the genetic legacy of high-altitude peoples. In Africa, ghost lineages left traces that influenced immunity and metabolism. In Oceania and island Southeast Asia, small-bodied humans may have lived long enough to imprint themselves into local myths. In every region, Homo sapiens carried the weight of a different absence, and those absences shaped our stories, art, rituals, and fears. But being the last human species was not the final transformation. It was only the threshold, because once we realized we were alone, something else awakened within us. A drive to explore, a drive to understand, a drive to map the world, master the world, and eventually transform the world. This drive was not born of ambition. It was born of curiosity and vulnerability intertwined. The world was enormous. We were small. We did not know how long we would survive, and so we began to reach. As the Ice Age advanced and receded, Homo sapiens spread into new lands, following herds, following rivers, following stars, following stories of distant places told by elders who remembered distant fires. Because now, without rivals, without other human species to remind us of our place, we became free to reshape not only the earth, but our destiny. The next block will explore how Homo sapiens stepped into this freedom, how we expanded across the globe with unprecedented speed, and how that expansion completed the disappearance of every last remnant of the other humans. We became explorers. We became colonizers of entire ecosystems. We became storytellers carrying the last memories of a world filled with many kinds of humans. And in doing so, we crossed the line that separated the age of many humans from the age of the human world. What came next was expansion on a scale that no species before or since has ever achieved. The last line echoes like a distant horizon calling out to wandering feet. Expansion on a scale no species before or since has ever achieved. To understand how Homo sapiens finalized its role as the last human species, we must follow our ancestors as they surged across the world in a movement so massive, so rapid, and so transformative that it reshaped not only the landscape, but the destiny of life itself. This expansion, spanning tens of thousands of years, was not a single event. It was a pulse, a heartbeat that beat across continents, a tide that rose and fell and rose again, each wave altering the world in subtle and dramatic ways. And unlike any human species before us, Homo sapiens did not expand because they were forced to. They expanded because they could, because imagination had unlocked the map of the world long before the world itself was explored, because curiosity had become a compass, because the unknown was no longer something to fear, but something to seek. This is where we begin. Picture an early Homo sapiens band leaving a familiar valley. Their feet press into soft soil. Their backs carry bundles of food and tools. Their eyes scan the horizon, searching not only for threats, but for possibilities. They follow herds along ancient paths. They cross rivers guided by memory and story. They climb ridges with a sense that something lies beyond. They do not know where they are going, but they go. This pattern repeated across thousands of generations, from Africa into the Levant, from the Levant into Eurasia, from Eurasia into Australia, from Siberia into the Americas, from islands to islands across the Pacific. This expansion was not random wandering. It was purposeful exploration, shaped by networks of knowledge transmitted by language and imagination. To understand this better, we must view the world not as a globe, but as a series of thresholds. At each threshold, a species faced a choice: stop or continue. Neanderthals often stopped because their strategies were optimized for specific environments. Denisovans stopped because altitude and cold shaped their adaptations. Small-bodied humans stopped because the ocean stopped them. Ghost lineages stopped because evolving environments trapped them in shrinking ecological pockets. Homo sapiens never fully stopped. Every threshold was simply another beginning. When a mountain range appeared, we crossed it. When a desert stretched for miles, we traversed it. When the ocean blocked our path, we sailed across it. When the tundra froze solid, we adapted clothing, tools, and fire to cross it. This is the difference that rewrote the fate of the world. Our expansion was not limited by environment. It was fueled by possibility. As Homo sapiens expanded, the final chapters of the other human species closed, not through war, not through deliberate eradication, but through the pressure of adaptation itself. A species that can thrive in any landscape will eventually reshape all landscapes. A species that innovates faster than evolution can react will eventually outrun every competitor. A species that networks knowledge across vast distances will eventually dominate every ecological niche. This is exactly what happened. Let us trace this expansion, not geographically, but psychologically, because the mind of early Homo sapiens tells us more than the footprints they left behind. The first wave spread out of Africa more than 70,000 years ago. These pioneers encountered Neanderthals in the Near East, exchanged genes, shared the land, and continued onward. A second wave followed, carrying new tools and symbols. A third wave carried innovations like blade technology, bone points, and ornaments. Each wave learned from the last, inherited stories, adopted improvements, and moved farther. This cumulative knowledge was something no other species could match. When the climate shifted, Homo sapiens adjusted not over millennia, but over generations. When prey changed patterns, humans reorganized strategies. When predators learned new tactics, humans adapted faster. But adaptation alone did not fuel the expansion. Meaning fueled it. Humans walked not only to survive, but to understand, to connect, and to fulfill something deep within the psyche. A restlessness, a curiosity, a hunger for what lay beyond. This drive carried humans along the coasts of Asia, where rich marine resources supported thriving communities. It carried them into ancient Australia, where they encountered megafauna and altered ecosystems with fire. It carried them into Europe, where the symbolic explosion of art reached levels unmatched for tens of thousands of years. It carried them into Siberia, where they adapted to one of the harshest climates on Earth. It carried them across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, a continent untouched by humanity until their arrival. Within 10,000 years of their arrival in the Americas, humans had traversed from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America. No other species had ever moved this fast across territory this vast. This expansion had consequences far beyond the disappearance of other human species. First, it reshaped ecosystems. Animals that once moved freely now encountered a new apex predator. Plants adapted to new patterns of fire and harvesting. Predators like saber-toothed cats faced pressures they had never known. Second, it reshaped climates. Fire usage altered landscapes. Migration patterns changed plant distribution. Tool usage affected animal populations in ways that cascaded across ecosystems. Third, it reshaped meaning itself. New lands inspired new stories. New threats inspired new rituals. New discoveries inspired new symbols. New interactions inspired new art. As humans encountered landscapes without other humans, they projected spirits, ancestors, and forces into them. Mountains became sacred. Rivers became divine. Forests became alive with mythic presence. This spiritual mapping of the world was a response to the absence of other humans. The earth felt vast and empty, and the human mind filled it with meaning. But as the expansion continued, something else occurred, something both subtle and profound. The memory of the other humans began to fade. Their final echoes persisted in stories, but grew distant. Their faces blurred. Their names were never recorded, but persisted in mythic fragments. Over time, those fragments morphed into archetypes that appear across nearly all ancient cultures. The giants, the little forest people, the mountain spirits, the ancient ones, the ancestors who came before, the people beneath the earth, the first humans who shaped the world. These archetypes did not arise from nothing. They arose from memory transformed by imagination. But as Homo sapiens spread farther, the distance between living people and the last memories of the others grew. By the time humans reached the far edges of the world, the Americas, remote Pacific islands, Arctic frontiers, the others were no longer part of living memory. We had become fully, undeniably alone. This loneliness shaped us. It reshaped our consciousness. It deepened our myths. It intensified our need for story, for meaning, for connection beyond the physical. It set the stage for the rise of religion, the rise of philosophy, the rise of lineage-based identity, the rise of cultural universes built entirely by humans, for humans. For the first time, the human mind was the only mind of its kind on the planet, and the earth became a canvas for our imagination, for better and for worse. But the expansion was not over, because once humans had filled the world horizontally, they began to expand vertically, into memory, into story, into culture, into identity, into meaning. The next block will explore how humans began to build symbolic worlds so vast and so complex that they created entire civilizations thousands of years later. The expansion of our species did not end when we filled the continents. It continued inside us, inside our minds, inside our stories, inside the collective consciousness of a species with no rivals, no equals, and no boundaries but those it created for itself. We had filled the earth with our footsteps. Now we would fill it with our imagination. The last line pulses like the heartbeat of a new world. Humans filled the earth with their footsteps, and now they would fill it with imagination. But imagination alone was not enough to shape the destiny that followed. What emerged next was something even more powerful, something that would ignite the slow dawn leading to civilizations. The rise of memory empires. A memory empire is not a kingdom of stone or bronze. It is not built with walls or armies. It is built with stories, with symbols, with rituals, with shared understanding passed across generations through the fragile medium of human minds. To understand how humanity entered this era, we must remember that Homo sapiens had just become the last humans on Earth. No rivals, no mirrors, no equals. In this solitude, something extraordinary happened. Sapiens began organizing their entire existence around the mental worlds they created. Not merely around food, shelter, or survival, but around invisible structures of meaning that extended far beyond the physical environment. This is where the human world truly emerged. Imagine an Ice Age camp at dusk. The fire burns low. Children gather around elders whose faces glow in the orange flicker. The air is cold, the night heavy with silence. Then a story begins. It is not a story of the present. It is a story of ancestors, of spirits, of animals that speak across dreams, of beings who shaped the rivers and mountains, of the people who came before, of the lessons that must never be forgotten. In that moment, something profound takes place. Knowledge is not simply transmitted. It is codified. It becomes sacred. It becomes memory that transcends generations. This is a memory empire, and as humans spread across continents, these empires grew more diverse and more intricate. Across Europe, humans painted caves with stories of the hunt, the seasons, the spirits of animals, and the invisible forces that govern their world. These paintings were not simple art. They were the ritualized memory of entire cultures, a kind of visual scripture painted 20,000 years before writing. Across Africa, early humans carved symbols into ochre, painted on stone walls, buried their dead with ornaments, and passed on knowledge through lineage chants. These practices formed deep, ancient memory traditions that continue to echo through the rhythms of African culture today. Across Australia, some of the earliest spiritual systems in human history emerged. Stories of creation, of ancestral beings, of the land itself as alive with meaning. These memory empires were so strong that elements of them survived tens of thousands of years intact, carried forward in oral tradition. Across Asia, humans carved small figurines, made beads from bone and ivory, shaped early masks, and prepared rituals for fertility, protection, and weather. These objects were not functional tools. They were memory anchors. Across the Americas, humans developed mythologies that carried the weight of migrations, landscapes, and ancestors into stories of sky animals, earth creators, trickster spirits, and underworld journeys. Everywhere Homo sapiens went, memory became architecture, invisible architecture. And for the first time in the history of life, a species built its world from the inside out. No other species could do this. Not the Neanderthals, not the Denisovans, not the small-bodied island humans, not the ghost lineages that once walked the plains of Africa. This internal world became the foundation for everything that followed, including civilization. But in these early stages, its power was far more subtle and far more primal. It was the power of collective identity. When Homo sapiens became the last humans, the absence of others amplified the need for belonging within our own species. Tribes became source of meaning. Clans became symbols of ancestry. Lineages became sacred. Elders became vessels of memory. Children became carriers of tradition. This deepened connection strengthened human communities in ways that increased survival dramatically. When drought struck, the memory empire provided knowledge of past strategies. When predators threatened, the memory empire preserved successful defense patterns. When migrations were required, the memory empire guided direction. When fear overwhelmed, the memory empire provided myths that soothed the mind. But these traditions also reinforced another transformation, the shaping of morality. For the first time, humans created shared rules and expectations not mandated by nature, but by story. Do not steal fire from the coals of another family. Do not hunt during the sacred season. Do not harm members of your alliance. Do not eat certain animals associated with ancestral spirits. Always care for the elders. Always pass on the stories. These were not laws in the modern sense. They were memory-encoded instructions for survival. Morality began as a strategy for cohesion, a strategy sharpened by the disappearance of other humans. Because after we became the only species of human, our threats came not from outside but from within. Conflict, jealousy, betrayal, resource competition. The memory empires helped regulate these tensions by giving people shared belief systems that maintained peace and order. And from these early moral systems, a deeper human trait emerged: empathy. Empathy existed before this era, of course. Humans had cared for injured members for hundreds of thousands of years. But once memory became symbolic, empathy became ritualized. Caring for the dead, comforting the grieving, tending to infants not one's own, sharing food beyond immediate kin, aiding the sick or elderly even when they could not contribute. This was a new kind of humanity, one shaped not only by survival, but by meaning. But alongside empathy came something darker, something born from the same capacity for memory and imagination: fear. Fear of the unseen, fear of spirits, fear of curses, fear of the wilderness, fear of the unknown, fear of the others who once lived. The knowledge that we had been surrounded by other humans for hundreds of thousands of years left a void when they vanished, a void the mind filled with shadows. Many early myths describe beings who once existed but no longer do. In some stories, they fled underground. In others, they became spirits of the mountains or forests. In others, they retreated to the edges of the world. In still others, they perished in ancient catastrophes. These myths reflect a psychological truth. Humans needed explanations for the absence of beings who were once neighbors. The memory empire was not only a repository of knowledge, it was a framework for making sense of a lonely world. But something else emerged from these early symbolic systems, something that would shape human history more than any tool ever created: the first seeds of culture-wide destiny. As humans wove stories of origins, ancestors, creation, and purpose, they began to see themselves not as mere survivors, but as successors, the inheritors of a world left behind by others, the chosen ones who continued the human story, the carriers of a flame handed down through countless generations. It is no coincidence that some of the earliest myths describe humans emerging from the earth after others had been swept away by a flood or fire. These myths are symbolic memories of real events, the disappearance of other humans. Perhaps this is why nearly every ancient culture speaks of a time when humans were not alone, and a time when something happened that left us solitary. As memory empires grew, so did our sense of destiny, not grand or imperial destiny, not kings or nations, but something deeper, a feeling that we were meant to continue the story of humanity. This feeling helped unify early communities. It helped carry knowledge across migrations. It helped preserve identity across generations. And this sense of destiny widened the human world inward, creating layers of meaning, tradition, and myth so rich that they became structures almost as real as the physical world. But this transformation was not the final stage, because as memory empires grew, another revolution began. A revolution of tools, techniques, and innovations that allowed Homo sapiens to master environments in ways no species ever had. This is where the seeds of civilization were planted, not in fields or cities, but in the minds of a species that had realized it was both alone and responsible. The next block will explore how this growing complexity led to the great leap toward mastery of nature, how humans went from memory to technology, from ritual to innovation, from scattered bands to the earliest forms of organized society. The rise of memory empires was the foundation. What comes next will be the construction of the human world itself. The last line glows like the first spark of a hammer striking metal. The construction of the human world itself. For hundreds of thousands of years, Earth belonged to many human species. But once Homo sapiens became the last, something irreversible began. We stepped into a role no species had ever held before, the world's sole architects of meaning, memory, strategy, and imagination. And it was within this new psychological landscape that humanity started forging the first tools of mastery. Not stone blades or spear points, for those existed long before. What emerged now were the systems that would one day evolve into agriculture, architecture, trade, governance, and eventually civilization. This was the forging of the human world. To understand how this began, we must picture humanity during the last great pulse of the Ice Age, not as wandering nomads without structure, but as skilled, adaptable, and imaginative communities whose minds reshaped everything they touched. Picture a sapiens camp on a wind-swept ridge. The mammoths move slowly across the plains below. The air smells of wood smoke and snow. A child sits beside an elder, watching as the elder scrapes a bone with a piece of flint. The bone becomes a needle. The needle becomes a tool that will stitch together finely tailored clothing capable of withstanding freezing winds. The elder teaches. The child learns. Knowledge transfers seamlessly, intentionally. This is not simple imitation. This is instruction. This is mastery passed through memory empires. From this foundation, innovation ignites. The tailoring of clothing expands human reach into colder climates. Sapiens push northward into territories where Neanderthals once thrived. Not through strength, but through technology. Not through brute force, but through shared knowledge. Innovation becomes contagious. One group perfects a technique. Another group hears about it. The improvement spreads across dozens of rivers and mountains through trade, marriage alliances, and traveling storytellers who carry ideas like seeds on the wind. This is the first great technological network, invisible but powerful. As clothing advances, shelters advance. Not crude huts, but complex constructions of wood, bone, hide, and stone. Some early sapiens built structures from mammoth bones arranged in circles, covered with hide and reinforced with soil. They created windbreaks, storage pits, and controlled fire hearths that allowed long-term habitation. Shelters were not improvised, they were engineered. This marks a shift no other human species achieved at scale. Neanderthals built shelters. Denisovans likely did as well. But sapiens refined them continuously, turning temporary survival strategies into proto-architecture. And as architecture took root, something else followed: territorial planning. Sapiens began to mark places with meaning. Certain valleys became winter camps. Certain cliffs became ritual sites. Certain caves became sanctuaries for art and ceremony. These were not random choices. They were deliberate decisions based on tradition, memory, and identity. Landscape became culture. Culture became landscape. And this relationship laid the groundwork for something deeper, the first systems of resource management. When humans returned to the same valley year after year, they observed patterns: animal migrations, plant cycles, weather shifts, seasonal changes. They tracked these patterns with stories, symbols, and rituals. Certain times of the year became sacred not because of supernatural meaning alone, but because they aligned with ecological knowledge. Myth became a calendar. Song became a map. Ritual became a survival strategy. This integration of meaning and observation marks one of the most important cognitive innovations in human history. It is the seed of science. Not science as we know it, but the slow accumulation of predictive knowledge through shared memory. When to hunt, when to gather, when to move, when to stay, when to respect a territory that needed time to recover. These insights transformed survival from reaction into planning. While other species adapted to the environment, Homo sapiens began adapting the environment to themselves. Fire becomes central to this. Humans did not merely use fire. They shaped landscapes with it, burning patches of grassland to attract new growth, driving game into predictable paths, opening corridors through forests, protecting settlements from predators. This technique, called fire stick farming in Australia's ancient traditions, is one example of early landscape engineering practiced worldwide, and its effect was massive. Fire reshaped entire ecosystems, grasslands expanded, new species thrived, thrived, old species declined. Humans were no longer participants in the ecosystem. They were directors. But the forging of the human world did not stop at fire, clothing, shelter, or seasonal planning. It accelerated when humans began creating the first large-scale gathering sites. Archaeological evidence shows that tens of thousands of years before agriculture, humans built places where hundreds or even thousands of people gathered seasonally. These were not villages. They were proto-cities of ritual and exchange. In these places, humans traded tools, materials, pigments, shell beads, stories, and potential mates. These gatherings prevented inbreeding, fostered alliances, and strengthened cultural identity across enormous distances. Imagine a valley where hundreds of people gather from dozens of groups, a place of ritual, a place of trade, a place of matchmaking, a place of storytelling, a place of music and dance, a place where myths grew deeper and traditions grew stronger. These gatherings were the first large-scale human networks, and they set the stage for everything that came later. Large societies, trade routes, shared religions, collective projects, civilization. But before civilization could emerge, humanity had to master one more element. Not land, not fire, not animals, time. Homo sapiens developed a relationship with time that no other species possessed. Memory allowed us to look back. Story allowed us to project forward. Symbolic thought allowed us to connect past and future. Ritual allowed us to repeat patterns consistently. This relationship with time made planning possible. Planning made coordination possible. Coordination made innovation unstoppable. And innovation drove transformation. But transformation created pressures. Every new tool changed the relationship between humans and nature. Every new method altered the balance of ecosystems. Every new strategy increased population resilience. As sapiens' populations grew, the world grew smaller. Territories once empty now supported large human networks. Hunting grounds became shared spaces. Migration routes became highways of information and exchange. The more humans spread, the more the Earth transformed. The more the Earth transformed, the more humans adapted. The more humans adapted, the less room remained for animals and environments that were once dominant. This includes the last remaining pockets of other human species, if any were still alive. By this time, the world had become so thoroughly shaped by Homo sapiens that no other human lineage could re-emerge or reclaim territory. The window had closed. The forging of the human world ensured that the age of other humans was over. But this forging process had another, deeper effect. It changed humans themselves, not biologically, culturally, psychologically, socially. Humans became builders of reality, creators of identity, shapers of destiny. And with this shift came the final great transformation before the birth of civilization, the rise of collective purpose, a sense that humanity was not simply surviving, but moving toward something, a sense encoded in myths of cosmic cycles, ancestral journeys, divine origins, and chosen paths. This sense of purpose would one day give rise to temples, kingdoms, scripts, and empires. But its roots lie here, in the Ice Age, in the forging of the human world. Because once humans learned to reshape nature, time, and meaning, civilization was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. The next block will explore the final transformation before the story reaches its end, the moment humanity understood its own uniqueness, and the moment the last of the other humans faded not only from existence, but from memory. What comes next is the threshold between prehistory and the dawn of the human era, a threshold shaped by loss, by curiosity, and by the question that still echoes today. What does it mean to be the last human species? The last line hangs over us like a deep breath drawn before dawn. What does it mean to be the last human species? To answer that question, we must step into an era when the world had already been reshaped by Homo sapiens, when our ancestors had crossed continents, forged memory empires, built symbolic worlds, engineered landscapes, and learned to think in stories that stretched across generations. It was in this era that an even deeper transformation took place, one that shaped not only who we were then, but who we still are today. Because once the others disappeared, Homo sapiens carried a burden no species had ever carried before. The burden of being alone, the burden of being aware, the burden of being responsible, the burden of remembering a world that no longer existed. This burden was not obvious. It did not appear in tools or bones or ruins. It appeared in the mind. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had lived in a world of plurality, a world where different kinds of humans walked the earth, a world where coexistence, conflict, avoidance, blending, and boundary-making were part of the deep structure of life. But after 40,000 years ago, the plural world disappeared. Only Homo sapiens remained, and with that solitude came a fundamental shift in consciousness. Before, humans had been defined by comparison, defined by difference, defined by encounters with beings who were like them and yet not like them. After, humans had only themselves for reflection. No rivals, no parallels, no alternatives. This singularity of existence created a new category of thought, identity. What does it mean to be human if we are the only humans left? What separates us from animals? What connects us to ancestors? What role do we play in the world? Why did the others disappear? Why did we survive? These questions seeded early mythologies, ritual structures, spiritual beliefs, and the philosophical foundations of humanity. It is no coincidence that the earliest signs of complex burial practices intensify after the others vanish. Homo sapiens began to bury their dead not merely for hygiene or ritual habit, but with meaning. They placed tools beside bodies, pigments on the skin, ornaments on the limbs, flowers or herbs near the remains. Sometimes entire animal parts were placed alongside the dead, symbols of journeys or transformations. These practices reflect a species grappling with mortality in a new way. The death of a sapien was no longer one among many branches of humanity. It was the extinguishing of a singular lineage. Every life became symbolic. Every death became profound. This sense of symbolic life expanded outward. Humans began to think of ancestors not merely as biological forebears, but as spiritual predecessors. Ancestors became guides, guardians, watchers, teachers. The living felt connected to an unbroken chain stretching back to the beginning of humanity. But with that connection came another haunting realization. The others were gone, but their memory lingered. This memory did not remain factual. It transformed into myth. Myths of those who came before, myths of giants, myths of small beings, myths of ancient races, myths of forgotten humans who once shared the world. Across Europe, later myths described beings who lived in mountains before humans arrived. Across Oceania, myths describe ancestral first people who lived in forests long before sapiens stepped ashore. Across Asia, myths tell of powerful mountain spirits who resemble humans but are not human. Across Africa, myths describe ancient beings who emerged from the earth before modern humans existed. These stories are not random. They are echoes. Echoes of a time when many human species coexisted. Echoes of memories passed through generations, transformed by imagination, deepened by ritual, and preserved in oral traditions. The burden of being human includes the burden of remembering those who came before us, and the burden of understanding that their absence shaped our identity. But there is another dimension to this burden: responsibility. Once Homo sapiens became the only human species, every action carried more weight. Every change we made to the ecosystem altered the destiny of countless species. Every migration redefined landscapes. Every innovation created ripples that shaped the future. This awareness did not appear instantly, but it grew over time, rooted in stories and rituals that emphasized balance, respect, caution, and cosmic order. Early hunter-gatherer societies developed rules about when and how to hunt, how to treat animals, how to honor the spirit of prey, how to respect sacred places, and how to maintain harmony with the land. These traditions were not superstition. They were early expressions of responsibility, a recognition that humanity's role in the world had changed. We were no longer just participants. We were stewards. We were carriers of memory. We were protectors of a fragile flame of consciousness that no other species held. This heightened awareness became the foundation for moral systems, systems that shaped behavior long before writing, long before laws, long before cities. Morality emerged not from civilization, but from the loneliness of being the last humans. It was a response to loss, a response to memory, a response to the recognition that survival was not enough. We needed meaning. But this burden carried a shadow as well. The same imagination that created empathy also created fear. The same symbolic thinking that birthed ritual also birthed paranoia. The same myths that honored ancestors also warned of dangers in the unseen. Humans began to fear the wilderness more deeply, to fear the night more intensely, to fear spirits, curses, omens, and unseen threats that might fill the world that once held other humans. These fears were not primitive. They were psychological adaptations, precautions shaped by a mind aware of its vulnerability, its fragility, and its uniqueness. And as humans built memory empires and symbolic worlds, they also built a sense of destiny. Not destiny as conquest or empire, but destiny as continuity. The human story had to continue. The flame had to be carried forward. The world had to remember. This sense of destiny is why humans buried their dead carefully, why they taught stories to children, why they painted cave walls with images of animals and spirits, why they created rituals marking birth, puberty, marriage, and death, why they developed myths explaining the origins of humanity. These actions were not random. They were attempts to anchor identity in a rapidly changing world. The burden of being human was becoming clear. To carry forward the memory of a world that no longer existed, to build meaning in a world newly empty of equals, and to preserve the continuity of a lineage now alone in its kind. But there is one more layer to this burden, the darkest and most transformative. For as humanity spread, as memory deepened, as imagination expanded, something unexpected happened. Something that would shape the destiny of our species forever. Humans began to realize they were not just survivors, they were creators, creators of tools, creators of meaning, creators of worlds, creators of the future. This realization unlocked a kind of confidence, or danger, that no other species had ever possessed. If the world could be shaped, then it could be changed. If the world could be changed, then it could be planned. If it could be planned, then humans could take responsibility for shaping the future. This laid the foundation for agriculture, for cities, for laws, for writing, for civilization. But the seeds of these transformations were sown in the ancient loneliness of being the last humans. And before we reach the end of this journey, before we step into the final block, there is one last question we must confront. If we are the last humans, what does that make us? The next block, the final chapter, will reflect on this question. It will tie together everything that came before, the plural world, the disappearances, the merging, the myths, the expansion, and the forging of the human world. Because in the end, the story of the lost humans is not just their story, it is ours. And understanding why they vanished means understanding who we truly are. The last line settles over us like falling ash. Understanding why they vanished means understanding who we truly are. Because this story, though rooted in ancient bones and forgotten migrations, is not simply about what happened 40,000 years ago. It is about what it means to be human now. To close this journey, we must return to the question that has been echoing beneath every chapter, every encounter, every extinction, every myth. What does it mean to be the last humans? To answer this, we must stand at the edge of time and look backward. Behind us stretches a world filled with beings who were almost like us, yet profoundly different. A world where at least 6 species of humans breathed the same air, walked the same plains, hunted the same animals, dreamed under the same stars. Homo erectus, the wanderer, Neanderthals, the cold-forged masters of Europe, Denisovans, the giants of the mountains, Homo floresiensis, the small-bodied island survivors, Homo luzonensis, the mosaic people of the Philippines, Homo naledi, the deep cave dwellers of Africa, and the ghost lineages whose faces we will never know but whose DNA whispers inside us still. They lived, they loved, they suffered, they learned, they adapted, they survived disasters that reshaped continents. They endured predators, winters, volcanic winters, droughts, and migrations, and then they disappeared, one by one, slowly, quietly, inevitably, not because they were inferior, not because they were weak, not because Homo sapiens was destined to rule. They vanished because the world changed faster than their strategies, because their populations were small, because climate oscillations fractured their territories, because diseases spread across expanding networks, because adaptation cannot always outrun unpredictability, but also, undeniably, because of us. The rise of Homo sapiens was not a triumph of brute force. It was a triumph of connection, a triumph of imagination, a triumph of adaptability, a triumph of stories, symbols, and alliances that grew stronger as the world grew colder. We did not conquer the others. We outlasted them through a mind that could envision possibilities beyond the present, communicate them across generations, and build worlds out of memory. And yet, something inside us remembers them. This remembrance appears in myths across continents, in stories of giants who shaped mountains, in tales of little forest beings who stole food at night, in legends of ancient spirits who walked before humanity, in the universal sense that the world once held other beings like us. Even today, the concept of the other human appears again and again in fiction, religion, and imagination. Perhaps it is no coincidence. Perhaps we are haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory, by the understanding that we once shared this world with others, and that we stand on the foundation of their long absence. What does it mean to be the last humans? It means we inherited a world shaped by countless hands, countless minds, countless species whose names we will never know. It means we carry their strengths, their adaptations, their DNA woven into our own. It means we are mosaics of ancient worlds, not the pure children of a linear lineage. To be the last humans means we carry both victory and loneliness, triumph and sorrow, responsibility and burden. Because if we are the last, it means there will never be another. No replacement, no successor, no cousin waiting beyond the mountains, no parallel lineage surviving in isolation. We are it, the final branch on a once mighty tree. This realization shaped the emergence of civilization. The first cities rose not from chaos, but from memory and imagination. Ritual centers became towns. Seasonal gatherings became trade hubs. Sacred spaces became political centers. Myths became laws. Lineages became dynasties. Oral tradition became writing. Memory became history. Humanity began to build the world not only as it was, but as it could be. This is the legacy of being the last humans. When no other species remained to reflect us, we reflected ourselves. When no other human minds walked beside us, we looked inward, then outward, then upward. We searched for meaning in stars, in rivers, in ancestors, in gods, in ourselves. But being the last humans also means we face a unique tension. On the one hand, we possess a mind unmatched in imagination, creativity, and potential. On the other, we inhabit a world where no other human species remains to remind us of our fragility. We often imagine ourselves as separate from nature, but this story teaches the opposite. We are not separate from the human family. We are what remains of it. Every extinction of every human species was a warning, though unspoken. A warning that survival is never guaranteed. A warning that intelligence alone is not enough. A warning that adaptability must be balanced with responsibility. A warning that even the most resilient branches of life can end in silence. We walk through the world as if our place is assured, but the bones of our cousins remind us that no species carries destiny by right. Being the last humans means carrying a flame that once burned across many hands, a flame that now belongs only to us, a flame we must not extinguish. Standing here, at the end of this narrative, we must reflect on the deeper truth revealed by the vanished species. Humanity is ancient, more ancient than civilization, more ancient than writing, more ancient than memory. We did not emerge alone. We emerged within a family of beings who shaped our journey long before our story began. Their triumphs are our triumphs. Their losses are our losses. Their disappearance is our inheritance. We often say humanity began with us, but that is not true. Humanity began long before Homo sapiens, in the minds of Neanderthals who mourned their dead, in the hands of Denisovans who carved tools in frozen mountains, in the feet of small-bodied humans who navigated volcanic islands, in the genes of ghost lineages who wandered Africa's deep past. We are not the beginning. We are the continuation, the last chapter of a book written by many hands. And so when we ask what it means to be human, the answer is both simple and profound. To be human is to remember. To be human is to imagine. To be human is to carry forward the legacy of a world filled with beings who dreamed before us. To be human is to walk alone, yet feel the presence of ancient footsteps beside us. To be human is to survive, but also to reflect, to create, to seek meaning in the silence left behind. We are the last humans, but we are also the storytellers of all who came before. And as long as we remember them, as long as we understand the gifts and warnings they left behind, we carry their legacy into the future. Because the truth is this: we are not the beginning of humanity. We are simply what remains. And it is now up to us, the last humans, to decide what the next chapter of the human story will be.